They never told you that Victorian beauty often began with pain disguised as elegance. Behind every polished curl was a routine shaped by control, silence, and hidden wounds. The more you look at those portraits, the more the truth slips out around the edges. Tonight, you will walk into that world and see what their hair never allowed them to say. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone were to walk into a Victorian parlour and simply watch the women as they entered, the first detail that would rise above the rustle of fabric and the glitter of jewellery would be the presence of their hair, arranged, elevated, and polished with a precision that revealed far more than beauty. In that world, hair was not just a natural feature, it was a structured message, crafted to signal one's position with every curl, twist, and glossy strand. The longer it was, the thicker it appeared, the more carefully it had been shaped, the clearer the statement became. This woman belonged to a class where time, labour, and resources existed solely to support her appearance. Across drawing rooms, streets lined with carriages, and narrow townhouse stairways, this expectation repeated itself without apology. Illustrations in fashion magazines glorified the image of abundant hair as if it were an effortless gift, untouched by the hands that shaped it. Women were praised for the density and length of their hair, though few acknowledged how many hours were spent brushing, oiling, dividing, and smoothing each section. The ideal was impossible for most, yet the pressure never softened. Hair became a measure of worth, and worth became something visible to anyone who cared to look. Those who had the privilege of domestic staff moved through this ritual with a practiced rhythm. Their hair was brushed hundreds of times each morning, carefully scented, arranged into elaborate structures, and reinforced with ribbons, pins, and supports hidden beneath the outer layers. The complexity of the style was itself a symbol. The more intricate the arrangement, the more clearly it signaled wealth and the presence of unseen hands working behind the scenes. A hairstyle was never just a hairstyle. It was evidence of leisure, comfort, and distance from hardship. But for women outside these privileged circles, hair existed under entirely different conditions. Working-class women laboured in factories filled with steam and soot, stood for hours in marketplaces, or ran households where every minute was spent on survival. Their hair bore the proof of exhaustion, flattened by heat, dirtied by smoke, tangled by wind. They had neither the means nor the hours required to shape their hair into the admired forms seen in portraits. Yet society judged them by the same standards, failing to recognise the absurdity of expecting elegance from lives structured around necessity. Victorian culture rarely forgave these differences. A woman whose hair appeared thin, unpolished, or hastily arranged risked being labelled improper or undisciplined. Appearances were treated as reflections of character rather than reflections of circumstance. Many women chose to hide their hair beneath bonnets not for modesty, but to escape the unspoken accusations that followed them. The divide between classes was not only economic, but it was also visible, woven into every strand. Within wealthy homes, the process of creating these admired hairstyles consumed entire mornings. Servants dedicated themselves to the task, knowing that precision mattered. A misplaced curl or uneven braid could be interpreted as a failure, not of the maid, but of the woman she served. Every detail carried meaning, and every deviation risked judgment. Beauty was expected to appear effortless, even though it depended entirely on effort. The weight of these hairstyles was not metaphorical. Coils and braids, pinned high and tightly wound, often strained the scalp and neck. Women tolerated headaches, tension, and discomfort in silence, believing that endurance was simply part of their duty. Some used padding beneath their hair to create volume, while others relied on pieces of false hair to maintain the illusion of natural fullness. Many considered this necessary because without such measures, the appearance of status would collapse. Paintings and photographs reinforced the fantasy. Artists exaggerated volume and smoothness. Photographers arranged hair for hours before capturing a single image, and magazines printed interpretations of styles that most women would never achieve. Yet these illusions became expectations. Women compared themselves to impossibilities, persuaded that their struggle to meet the standard reflected personal inadequacy rather than structural inequality. For daughters raised in this world, hair became a lifelong responsibility. Mothers taught them that proper grooming was an obligation, not a choice. Husbands and suitors evaluated them as much by appearance as by conversation. In subtle ways, hair became a tool of control, a reminder that a woman's place could be affirmed or questioned based on the impression she presented. The rules were unstated but strictly enforced. Beauty required discipline, and discipline required compliance. Those who attempted to break from these expectations found themselves facing unspoken punishment. Cutting one's hair short could be read as rebellion. Allowing it to fall freely without arrangement could provoke gossip. Failing to meet the standard could quietly close doors to social acceptance. Through these invisible pressures, society shaped behavior as effectively as any law. As fashions changed, the burden simply shifted to new forms. Styles moved from cascading waves to towering constructions to carefully bound coils. But the underlying message remained the same. A woman's hair existed for others to evaluate. Her place in society began above her forehead, framed by the strands she could manage to tame. In this world, the gleam of polished hair was less a sign of beauty and more a sign of what it cost. Hours of hidden labor, unspoken discomfort, the work of other women, and the constant fear of being judged for appearing less than perfect. Behind every admired hairstyle was a quiet truth. Beauty was constructed, controlled, and expected, long before it was ever appreciated. The polished surface of these admired hairstyles reveals only a fragment of the world that shaped them. Once that surface is examined more closely, the pressures beneath it become difficult to ignore. And somewhere just beyond that polished image lies something far more unsettling, waiting to be seen. The act of styling hair in the Victorian era was never a simple matter of grooming. It was a daily ritual that consumed time with an ease that only a society built upon rigid expectations could sustain. Each morning began with the quiet acknowledgement that hair would demand attention before anything else. The length alone required careful brushing, often hundreds of strokes, just to prepare it for the shaping that followed. For many women, several minutes were never enough. The process stretched into half an hour, or longer, depending on how elaborate the desired style needed to be. The patience required became a silent part of daily life, accepted not because it was practical, but because the world around them insisted that beauty must look intentional. The tools used each morning told their own story. Heavy brushes with stiff bristles, combs carved from bone or metal, pots of pomade resting beside pins and ribbons. Each object added steps to a routine that rarely changed. Women learned early that hair could not be rushed. A single tangle left unresolved would disrupt the structure later. Time slipped away as strands were divided, smoothed, twisted, and pinned into place. The rhythm of the process revealed an unspoken truth. Maintaining the appearance of elegance required hours of hidden labor. Every polished curl seen in public carried behind it the memory of minutes stretched into long, quiet sessions of preparation. This burden was not one most women carried alone. Those with wealth relied on the hands of servants or professional hairdressers, whose skills were essential in shaping hair into the forms expected by society. A maid could spend a significant portion of her morning working on a single head of hair, adjusting the arrangement repeatedly until it met the standard her employer demanded. The presence of a skilled assistant was what allowed many Victorian women to present themselves with the calm appearance that others admired. Without such help, the complexity of the styles would have made them nearly impossible to achieve. The divide between classes became clear through this dependency. Women without access to help faced the same expectations, but lacked the time required to meet them. They rose before dawn, not to style their hair, but to work, and long hours left little room for grooming rituals. Attempting to replicate upper-class hairstyles on their own consumed precious time that could not easily be spared. Many settled for simpler arrangements, not because they chose simplicity, but because daily survival did not allow otherwise. Their hair became another reminder of the distance between them and those who moved through life with hours available to dedicate to appearance. Even for women with servants, the routine was not without strain. Sitting still for extended periods, enduring the discomfort of tight pulling and repeated brushing, and tolerating the weight of freshly arranged hair, meant accepting physical fatigue as part of daily existence. A woman trained herself to ignore the ache in her neck or the lingering sting of a pulled strand. These inconveniences were seldom spoken aloud, because they were woven into the larger expectation that beauty was a form of discipline. The hours spent were seen as evidence of devotion to propriety, not as burdens. The time investment also shaped social behavior. Women planned outings, visits, and gatherings around the hours required for preparation. A morning invitation could disrupt the routine entirely, and a rushed style risked judgment. Those with higher status often arranged their schedules to ensure their hair could be styled properly before appearing in public. The amount of time available each day became a resource that influenced how they interacted with the world. In a society where appearance spoke louder than intention, the hours spent preparing hair became part of one's social identity. Fashion of the era further complicated this commitment. Each shift in style introduced new demands, and women adapted accordingly. When towering arrangements came into fashion, the time required increased. When structured waves or tightly bound coils were preferred, preparation changed again. The constancy of change meant that routine never became effortless. Women woke each day knowing their hair would once again require careful, time-consuming attention, a ritual repeated endlessly through years and decades. For the wealthy, time was the invisible luxury that made these routines possible. For everyone else, time was a limitation that exposed them to criticism. Society treated this difference not as a matter of circumstance, but as a matter of character. Those who managed their hair well were praised. Those who did not were quietly judged. The hours spent each morning became an investment in social acceptance, and the inability to commit those hours became a mark of inferiority in the eyes of others. The world often forgot that maintaining beauty required more time than many women could realistically give. The daily routine revealed more than vanity. It revealed the structure of the society itself. A polished hairstyle was rarely the result of a single person's effort. It reflected the presence of servants, the availability of leisure, the absence of physical labor, and the expectation that a woman's appearance was a priority that justified long stretches of preparation. Those who lived without these supports remained outside the ideal, not because their hair lacked potential, but because their lives lacked the hours required to shape it. In the quiet moments before a woman finally stepped out of her home, with her hair arranged and her posture fixed, the time she had spent lingered invisibly behind her. The world saw only the finished image, never the effort. The hours lost each morning left no trace except in the smoothness of each curl and the stability of each pinned strand. This absence of visible labor was part of what made Victorian beauty so misleading. What appeared effortless was built on time, patience, and help from others, things that many women could not afford. The long hours hidden behind each polished hairstyle reveal how much effort was required just to appear acceptable. These routines exposed the distance between those who could spare that time and those who could not. And somewhere behind this quiet struggle, another layer of the truth begins to take shape. Pomades and styling waxes used throughout the Victorian era carried a degree of importance that few questioned. Women incorporated these substances into their daily routines because maintaining sleek, controlled hair was an expectation woven deeply into society. Rendered animal fat formed the base of most formulas, giving the pomades a heavy, greasy texture that clung to the scalp and strands. To create a more pleasant impression, chemical fragrances were added, masking the natural odor of the ingredients. These mixtures produced a shine that signaled grooming and discipline, and many women came to rely on them as essential rather than optional. Behind the polished surface, however, were ingredients that modern eyes would immediately recognize as dangerous. Some manufacturers blended lead compounds into their pomades to give hair a paler, smoother appearance, especially under candlelight or in photographic studios. Others incorporated mercury salts to achieve a particular consistency or enhance scent retention. These additions were inexpensive and effective, which made them appealing to producers seeking profit in a market with few regulations. Women bought the products believing they supported beauty and hygiene, unaware that each application added another layer of slow toxicity. Daily grooming habits intensified these effects. Pomade was often warmed between the hands before being massaged directly into the scalp, making it easier for the mixture to melt and spread. Once applied, it hardened as it cooled, creating a firm coating that trapped dirt and perspiration. Because washing hair was an infrequent event, this build-up remained in place for days or weeks, absorbing soot from city air and smoke from coal fires. With each additional layer of product, the scalp received more prolonged exposure to compounds that were never designed to be safe. Over time, reactions appeared gradually rather than dramatically. Some women experienced constant itching or a lingering sense of tightness around the scalp. Others noticed small rashes, patches of redness, or unexpected hair thinning. These symptoms were often dismissed as minor inconveniences or sensitivities, especially since discomfort was already a common feature of daily grooming. Many had no reason to suspect the products they used so faithfully. Even when more severe symptoms emerged, such as persistent headaches or unexplained fatigue, the connection between pomade and illness rarely came to mind. Physicians of the era also struggled to identify the source of these ailments. Without modern tools or knowledge about the long-term effects of lead and mercury exposure, they attributed signs of poisoning to stress, climate change, or general weakness. This lack of understanding allowed harmful products to remain in circulation, and advertisements continued to promote them as beneficial aids for healthy, disciplined hair. Labels offered no ingredient lists, and manufacturers frequently altered formulas without notice. Trust filled the silence left by missing information, and consumers had little reason to question what they purchased. The cycle of harm extended beyond the women who used the products. Servants responsible for applying pomades often worked with bare hands, absorbing toxic compounds through their skin during long grooming sessions. They handled jars repeatedly, warmed mixtures, massaged them into scalps, and cleaned the residue from combs and brushes. Prolonged exposure caused soreness and irritation, yet these reactions went unacknowledged in households where their labor remained largely invisible. The risks embedded in the beauty routines affected everyone involved, not only those whose hair required constant maintenance. Dependence on these products grew stronger as the effects accumulated. Hair weakened as it became coated with layers of wax and fat, losing its natural flexibility and strength. Women applied thicker amounts to hide signs of breakage, dryness, or thinning, unaware that their efforts contributed to the cycle of damage. The substances meant to improve appearance often accelerated the deterioration of the hair they were meant to protect. Still, abandoning pomade was not an option for many. Without it, their hair fell flat, appeared unruly, or refused to hold the elaborate styles demanded by fashion. Society placed enormous value on presentation, leaving women with little choice but to continue using what harmed them. Appearance shaped reputation, and reputation shaped opportunity. A woman who arrived at a social event with dull or unstructured hair risked silent judgment from others, even if her decision to avoid pomade would have protected her health. Maintaining conformity mattered more than personal comfort or caution. In a world where beauty operated as a form of social currency, toxic products became part of the cost. Despite scattered reports of illness linked to cosmetics, public concern remained minimal. The lack of widespread understanding, coupled with the absence of regulations, kept harmful substances on shelves long after evidence suggested they posed a threat. The issue blended into the broader context of Victorian life, where danger existed in many familiar forms: air, water, workplaces, and crowded neighborhoods. Toxic hair products became yet another element of a society accustomed to invisible risks. What lingered behind each polished hairstyle was not only the scent of fragrance, but the silent presence of chemicals absorbed over time. Women continued their routines unaware that the shine in their hair came with unseen consequences. The elegance admired in public often concealed a quiet erosion of health underneath, a gradual shift that few recognized until symptoms appeared too firmly to ignore. The glossy finish created by these products concealed the slow impact of substances never meant for regular use. The further one examines the daily reliance on them, the more evident the underlying risks become. Somewhere within these mixtures, another hidden danger begins to reveal itself. Lack of frequent washing created an environment in which lice thrived easily within Victorian hairstyles, even among women who occupied the highest positions in society. The elaborate arrangements that appeared so polished in public often concealed weeks of accumulated oils, pomades, dust, and tightly compacted strands that provided warmth and shelter for insects. Hair that looked controlled and elegant from a distance carried a hidden reality that most people preferred not to acknowledge. In a world where appearance mattered more than comfort, lice became an unwelcome but common presence, tolerated quietly because the alternatives required time, water, and routines many women could not afford to maintain. Historical accounts describe cases in which queens, duchesses, and other noblewomen struggled with lice despite the care they received from servants. Their long hair, heavily styled and rarely washed, provided an ideal habitat for infestation. Servants brushed the hair daily, but brushing alone could not eliminate parasites that clung tightly to the scalp or laid eggs along the roots. The combination of pomade and infrequent cleaning created layers that lice could move through without difficulty. Even those who lived in palaces were not exempt from the discomfort that slowly developed beneath carefully arranged curls. Women of status often relied on specific tools designed to manage this problem. Scratching implements made from silver, bone, or ivory became ordinary household items, discreetly stored among brushes and pins. These tools served a practical purpose, relieving the persistent itch that accompanied lice. They were small enough to be hidden, allowing women to maintain the illusion of control while addressing the irritation. The fact that such tools were common among wealthy households indicated how widespread the issue truly was. No amount of social standing protected a woman from the consequences of grooming habits that prioritized appearance over hygiene. Servants responsible for styling hair also became closely involved in managing lice infestations. Their duties required them to work directly with the scalp, often noticing the signs long before their employers did. However, raising concerns was difficult. Admitting that a noble woman had lice risked embarrassment, and discretion was expected. In many cases, the task of removing lice or cleaning combs fell entirely to the maid, who faced the same exposure and discomfort, but without acknowledgement. Her work continued in silence, just as it did with pomades, washing basins, and countless other aspects of hair maintenance. Infestation flourished partly because hair washing occurred so infrequently. Many Victorian women avoided washing their hair more than once every few weeks, or even once a month. Water access, cold temperatures, and concerns about illness contributed to this pattern, while the heavy use of pomades made rinsing even more difficult. Once lice appeared, the conditions of daily grooming, tight braids, pinned coils, layers of wax, made the problem worse. Lice could hide easily within the structure of elaborate hairstyles, remaining unnoticed until the itching became impossible to ignore. The social expectations that demanded constant styling played a significant role in enabling infestations to persist. Women were reluctant to fully undo their hair, knowing that restyling it required hours of labor. Removing all the pins, brushing out knots, washing thoroughly, and then reconstructing the hairstyle was a task that consumed time many wealthy women had, but were reluctant to use, and time that working-class women simply did not possess. Leaving the hair intact allowed lice to remain undisturbed, feeding and reproducing within a structure that society admired from the outside. Public reactions to lice were shaped heavily by silence and avoidance. The issue carried embarrassment, especially among the upper classes, and so infestations rarely appeared in conversation. Instead, women tolerated the discomfort privately, relying on scratching tools, scented pomades, and tight restyling to mask the signs. Society encouraged them to maintain the facade of refinement, even if doing so meant ignoring an unpleasant truth. The image of cleanliness mattered far more than actual cleanliness, and lice became another hidden cost of meeting beauty standards. Working-class women faced the same issue but under different circumstances. Their hair often remained uncovered during long workdays, making them vulnerable to infestations that spread rapidly in crowded environments. Access to grooming tools was limited, and lice could remain for extended periods without treatment. Compared to the upper classes, these women had fewer ways to hide the problem. Yet society judged them more harshly, treating lice as a sign of moral or personal failure rather than a predictable result of living conditions and expectations shared by all women of the era. Medical understanding of lice was minimal, and available treatments were inconsistent. Some remedies relied on vinegar, oils, or combing methods that provided only temporary relief. Others involved harsh chemicals that irritated the scalp. In many cases, women simply accepted that lice were a recurring part of life. The discomfort became another quiet burden, adding to the physical strain already created by heavy hairstyles, toxic pomades, and tight arrangements. Despite the prevalence of lice, Victorian ideals continued to prioritize appearance over health. Women devoted hours to styling but far less time to cleaning, and the result was a contradiction that existed just beneath the surface. The polished exteriors, admired in paintings and illustrations, concealed conditions that few would have associated with nobility or refinement. What appeared orderly and graceful from afar often carried an underlying reality that revealed how fragile those standards truly were. Lice infestations, hidden beneath elaborate hairstyles, exposed how limited hygiene practices shaped daily life. These conditions revealed the distance between outward beauty and the discomfort maintained beneath it. Within that quiet tension, another truth begins to rise. Artificial hairpieces became an essential part of Victorian beauty routines, especially for women who struggled to achieve the fullness expected by society. These additions, made from human hair, horsehair, or blended fibers, were woven into daily hairstyles to create the illusion of thickness and natural abundance. From a distance, these pieces seemed seamless, fitting neatly into curls and braids. Up close, however, they carried with them risks that were rarely acknowledged. Many were stored without proper care, handled by multiple vendors, and transported through crowded markets where hygiene was minimal. By the time they reached the women who wore them, the hairpieces often carried dust, bacteria, and, in some cases, fungal spores that thrived in warm, untreated environments. Women who wore these additions experienced a mixture of pride and discomfort. Achieving the fashionable appearance of thick, structured hair required incorporating these pieces into daily routines, and once positioned, they were expected to stay in place for hours. Maintaining a composed public image meant enduring the weight and heat that accompanied them. The scalp beneath these additions remained covered, unable to breathe, and quickly became a place where moisture accumulated. This created an ideal environment for microbial growth. Over time, many women experienced irritation, tenderness, or a persistent itch that never fully disappeared. The construction of these pieces added to the problem. Human hair, collected from various sources, was rarely cleaned thoroughly. Vendors purchased it from individuals who sold their hair out of necessity, from orphanages needing income, and from barbers who gathered cut hair to sell in bulk. The strands were sorted, bundled, and tied together with materials that were not sterile. Horsehair pieces followed a similar path, often harvested directly from animals and processed with minimal treatment. When combined with pomades and waxes already present on the wearer's scalp, the untreated hairpieces introduced a new layer of contamination that quietly affected those who used them. Daily use concealed these issues effectively. Women who wore these pieces often did so without removing them for long stretches of time. The pressure of social expectation created a routine in which appearance overshadowed comfort and cleanliness. Removing and reinstalling hairpieces required time and assistance, and most women preferred to avoid the disruption. Instead, they adjusted the pieces slightly each morning before facing the public. The result was a prolonged period during which the scalp remained hidden beneath layers of natural and artificial hair, creating conditions that encouraged infection and inflammation. Over weeks and months, these conditions resulted in noticeable consequences. Some women developed early-stage hair loss around areas where the pieces were attached, caused by constant traction or underlying fungal infections. Others experienced redness, flaking, or painful sensitivity when touched. Since hairstyles often covered these areas, the symptoms remained invisible to others. Women tolerated the discomfort quietly, convinced that maintaining beauty required persistence. Social norms encouraged silence about these issues, leaving many to believe their symptoms were isolated rather than widespread. This silence extended into wealthier households, where servants handled the preparation and cleaning of hairpieces. They washed and brushed the additions without understanding the risks associated with improper sanitation. Their hands frequently came into contact with contaminated strands, and while they felt the same irritation, their discomfort carried no weight inside the homes they served. The expectations placed on women of status created parallel burdens for the servants responsible for maintaining appearances. Neither group received guidance or warnings about the risks inherent in using untreated hair products. The weight of the pieces added physical strain to the daily experience of wearing them. Heavier hair pieces created tension on the scalp, which, combined with infection or irritation, intensified discomfort. Women endured headaches and a lingering sense of pressure as they moved through social events. Removing the pieces at night brought temporary relief, but did little to address the underlying conditions that had developed throughout the day. The cycle continued with each morning's preparation, building gradually into issues that remained unspoken, yet widely shared. Medical understanding of scalp infections during the era was limited. Symptoms such as itching, hair loss, and inflammation were often attributed to poor constitution, stress, or environmental factors rather than to contaminated hairpieces. Treatments were inconsistent and sometimes ineffective, relying on vinegar rinses or harsh ointments that provided temporary relief without addressing the cause. Few made the connection between infections and the hairpieces they used daily, and even fewer recognized the importance of sanitizing these additions regularly. Despite the risks, hairpieces continued to be seen as essential. They allowed women to maintain a level of elegance demanded by social norms, and the pressure to appear composed outweighed health concerns. Beauty standards left little room for alternatives, and most women accepted the drawbacks as part of their obligation to present themselves properly. The presence of infection or discomfort became another concealed cost of maintaining the appearance of thick, well-styled hair. The polished exterior achieved through the use of hairpieces concealed a reality that many women carried quietly. Beneath the layers of arranged curls and added volume existed an environment that fostered illness, irritation, and gradual hair loss. Expectations of beauty in Victorian society left little room for questioning these risks, reinforcing a system in which appearance mattered more than physical well-being. Hairpieces worn daily created an illusion that hid the strain placed on the scalp beneath them. Their constant use revealed how beauty standards demanded endurance more than comfort. Under these conditions, another layer of hidden harm begins to surface. The market for wigs and hairpieces in the Victorian era depended on a supply chain built quietly on poverty, necessity, and the lack of choice faced by those at the bottom of society. Women who struggled to provide for their families saw their hair as one of the few assets they possessed, something that could be exchanged for a small sum when food or rent became urgent concerns. Cutting their hair did not bring pride or relief. It offered only temporary stability in a life shaped by scarcity. The transaction was simple but heavy in consequence. A woman walked into a shop with long hair and left with coins and a shortened identity, while the hair she once relied on for dignity entered a world where it would be treated as a commodity. Children in orphanages experienced an even harsher version of this exchange. Many institutions cut the hair of young girls and boys to sell in bulk, using the revenue to support daily operations. The children had no choice in the matter. Their hair was taken as routinely as their meals were served, handled by adults who saw it not as a personal feature, but as a source of income. The loss of hair became part of institutional life, disconnected from the emotional or physical discomfort of those affected. For the buyers, the origin of the hair rarely mattered. What mattered was its length, its texture, and how easily it could be integrated into fashionable styles. Merchants who specialized in hair collection operated quietly, moving between rural areas, city slums, and orphanages to gather as much as they could. The demand from wealthier customers ensured that the supply chain remained active, even if its origins were rarely discussed. Locks of hair were sorted, cleaned, superficially, bundled, and then shipped to wig makers, who transformed them into pieces that would be worn by women of far higher social standing than those who had provided the raw material. This upward movement of hair mirrored the upward movement of wealth, leaving behind the people whose contributions were essential but unacknowledged. In many cases, women who sold their hair did so under pressure from circumstances they could not control. Sudden unemployment, illness within the family, or rising food prices forced them to make decisions that eroded their sense of self. Hair was seen by society as a marker of beauty, modesty, and femininity. Yet economic hardship reduced it to something transactional. The emotional impact of this loss was rarely addressed. Women often avoided discussing it openly, knowing that others viewed the decision as a sign of misfortune rather than resilience. Their silence reinforced how deeply poverty influenced the availability of materials used in the creation of wigs. Workshops where wigs were assembled rarely questioned the origins of the hair they received. Artisans focused on craftsmanship, arranging strands into curls, braids, and structured pieces that matched current fashion trends. Their skill transformed raw hair into something elegant and admired, yet the final product concealed the reality of how it had been obtained. Customers saw only the polished creation, not the economic desperation behind it. The beauty they purchased relied on a process that many preferred not to examine too closely. Women who wore these wigs generally had little awareness of the experiences of those who provided the hair. They wore the pieces as symbols of refinement, status, and adherence to expectations. The smoothness and thickness of the wigs allowed them to maintain appearances that would have been difficult to achieve naturally. The comfort offered by the illusion of beauty outweighed any curiosity about where the hair originated. In a society comfortable with structural inequality, ignorance made participation easier. This lack of awareness extended to the broader public. Newspapers and fashion magazines discussed the styles achieved with wigs and hairpieces, but made little mention of the labor or conditions involved in producing them. The industry remained largely invisible by design. Wigs arrived in boxes neatly arranged and prepared for use with no trace of the people whose lives had shaped the raw material. The absence of transparency made it easier for consumers to accept the products without considering their ethical implications. As the industry expanded, more women found themselves relying on wigs to maintain the appearance expected in social settings. Natural hair thinned over time from tight styles, pomades, and infrequent washing, making wigs even more necessary. Demand increased steadily, ensuring that the economic pressure driving the supply chain remained constant. The relationship between beauty standards and exploitation became deeply embedded in daily life, unnoticed by those who benefited from it and unavoidable for those who fed it through necessity. Despite the clear imbalance in who profited from the trade, the practice continued without significant scrutiny. The silent contributions of poor women and orphaned children allowed wealthier women to present a polished exterior. The elegance admired in drawing rooms and social gatherings rested on the unseen sacrifices of people whose names would never be recorded. The industry functioned smoothly because it operated out of sight, shielded by social norms that valued appearance more than the hidden costs required to maintain it. The more one examines the structure of this trade, the more evident the divide becomes. Beauty in the Victorian era relied not only on time and labor, but also on a steady flow of materials obtained through hardship. Wigs served as symbols of refinement, yet their origins reflected a different reality, one rooted in survival rather than luxury. The contrast between who wore the wigs and who supplied them revealed an uncomfortable truth about how society assigned value. Wigs admired for their elegance concealed the economic pressure that made their creation possible. The quiet exchanges supporting the industry exposed how beauty standards relied on those with the least to give. Beneath this structure, another reality begins to emerge. The supply chain for wigs in the Victorian era extended beyond poverty and hardship into a realm that was rarely acknowledged openly. When the demand for long, healthy hair grew faster than what living donors could provide, another source quietly entered the trade. Morgues, hospitals, and undertakers became part of a system in which the hair of the deceased was collected, sorted, and prepared for sale. This practice evolved not through explicit approval, but through economic convenience. Bodies passed through these facilities daily, and their hair was seen as a resource that could be removed with little resistance, preserved, and transferred to merchants who understood its market value. Attendants who worked in these environments treated the removal of hair as another task within their routine. They cut the hair before formal preparations were made, placing the collected strands into bundles that would later be sold to wigmakers. The deceased had no say in the matter, and their families were rarely informed. Death certificates, burial procedures, and funeral arrangements continued without interruption. The hair left behind travelled along a separate path destined to be worn by women who sought thickness, shine, and fashionable volume. These women never learned whose hair had been woven into their own. Transactions between morgue staff and hair merchants were conducted discreetly. Payments ensured that the supply remained steady, and the nature of the trade encouraged silence. Merchants preferred not to disclose their sources, knowing that customers valued the appearance of cleanliness and refinement. The knowledge that hair had been taken from the dead risked damaging the industry, even though the hair itself looked no different from other materials once processed. Cleaned, combed, and styled it blended seamlessly into the wigs displayed in fashionable shops. For wig makers, the distinction between hair taken from the living and the deceased was irrelevant once the strands entered their workshops. Their focus remained on craftsmanship and consistency. They washed the hair, initially treated it with basic solutions, dried it, and then began arranging it into curls or braids according to current trends. The origin of the hair had no impact on how it performed in structure or durability. As long as it met the standards of length and health, it was incorporated without hesitation. This practical approach ensured that the industry continued to rely on morgue-sourced hair as quietly as it relied on hair sold by impoverished women or children. Women who eventually wore these wigs rarely questioned their origins. They purchased them in boutiques or received them through personal stylists who assured them of quality. Packaging, presentation, and the appearance of the wigs aligned with expectations of refinement. Social norms discouraged curiosity about the labor behind beauty products, and even if rumors circulated about questionable sources, they were dismissed as exaggerations. In an era where many aspects of life were shaped by unseen labor, the invisibility of this practice guaranteed its longevity. Inside the homes where these wigs were worn, their presence represented status and adherence to beauty standards. Women adjusted them before gatherings, wore them for hours at social functions, and entrusted servants to maintain their cleanliness. The wigs became part of daily life, blending into the routines that defined Victorian femininity. Their origins remained a distant concern, overshadowed by the importance placed on appearance and social acceptance. The hairpieces added volume and structure, allowing women to achieve styles that would have been impossible with natural hair alone. Yet the implications of using hair taken from the deceased extended beyond social unease. The conditions under which these wigs were produced raised questions about sanitation and health. Hair removed from bodies was not always washed promptly. In some facilities, the hair remained stored for days before merchants arrived, increasing the likelihood of bacterial presence or decay. By the time it reached wigmakers, it was often treated only superficially enough to neutralize odor, but not enough to ensure safety. Once the wigs were complete, they carried no visible trace of their origin, but the risks associated with improper handling remained embedded within them. Servants who cleaned and maintained these wigs faced the direct consequences of inadequate sanitation. They brushed and washed the pieces without protective equipment, relying on basic methods that did little to eliminate contaminants. Their discomfort, itching hands, irritated skin, or unexplained rashes were rarely connected to the wigs themselves. In households where hierarchy shaped every interaction, their symptoms carried little importance. They continued their work, unaware that the materials they handled daily might have originated from bodies prepared for burial. Despite these risks, the industry surrounding wigs continued to rely on morgue-sourced hair because it ensured a steady supply. Living donors could not meet the growing demand created by changing fashion trends, and hair obtained from the deceased offered a consistent alternative. As long as the wigs remained popular among wealthy women, the trade persisted with few questions raised. Moral considerations were overshadowed by the expectations placed on appearance. The industry's structure encouraged silence from everyone involved, allowing the practice to operate without public scrutiny. The disconnect between the elegance of the final product and the reality of its origins highlighted a broader inconsistency within Victorian society. Outward refinement was maintained through practices that contradicted the values associated with respectability. Those who purchased wigs participated unknowingly in a cycle that transformed death into a commodity. The lack of transparency ensured that the system remained functional, even as the ethics behind it remained unexamined. What remained most striking was how easily the presence of death became absorbed into everyday routines. The wigs blended into the rhythm of social life, worn at dinners, dances, and public events, without any trace of the lives that had contributed to them. The connection between the wearer and the deceased disappeared through layers of processing and presentation. The result was a seamless integration of hair obtained from death into the world of beauty. Processed wigs concealed the origins of the hair used to create them, allowing their presence to blend smoothly into daily life. This silence surrounding their production revealed how beauty standards overshadowed questions that might disrupt them. As the craft continued, another unsettling source of risk moved quietly into view. Curling devices made from solid metal became a standard tool in Victorian hairstyling, especially as elaborate shapes and structured curls grew increasingly popular. These tools were heated using charcoal braziers, open flames, or small stoves placed beside styling chairs. When the metal reached a temperature considered sufficient, hairdressers pressed the rods, clamps, or tongs directly onto the hair to create waves or tight curls. There were no reliable ways to measure heat, and most relied on guesswork, leading to unpredictable results. The same instrument that created fashionable curls could within seconds burn the hair shaft or scorch the scalp beneath it. Many women endured these procedures because beauty standards offered no alternative. Maintaining curls that held their shape for hours required extreme heat, especially in a period when hairsprays and modern styling products did not exist. The reliance on heat made accidents frequent. A momentary lapse in attention could cause strands to smoke, blacken, or disintegrate entirely. The smell of singed hair was so common that it became an ordinary part of hairstyling sessions, accepted as an unavoidable inconvenience. The damage was visible, yet few questioned the necessity of the process. The look of polished curls outweighed concerns about long-term harm. Hairdressers worked quickly, not because they wished to rush, but because heated metal cooled rapidly. To maintain the required temperature, they moved constantly between the flame and the customer, creating a rhythm in which the risk of burns remained constant throughout the session. Customers sat still, aware that even small movements could result in injury. These sessions demanded a level of stillness that created tension in the room, but the final appearance mattered more to both the stylist and the wearer. The process became a quiet negotiation between endurance and expectation. Beneath the hair, the scalp faced significant strain. Burns ranged from minor redness to blistering injuries that took weeks to heal. Some burns left small scars along the hairline or behind the ears, areas routinely contacted by heated tools. These injuries rarely received proper medical attention because they were considered private matters. Women concealed the wounds beneath hairstyles or accessories, and servants who witnessed the damage knew better than to speak of it. A culture shaped around maintaining composure discouraged any open acknowledgement of pain. Hair itself deteriorated gradually under repeated exposure to extreme heat. Strands weakened, became brittle, and broke easily. Over time, patches of thinning hair appeared, especially near the front and sides, where heated tools made the most contact. For many women, the visible damage created a cycle of dependency. Weakened natural hair required the addition of wigs or hairpieces, which then required even more styling to appear seamless. The very tools intended to produce beauty contributed to the decline of the natural features they were meant to enhance. Accidents involving flames added another layer of danger. In rooms lit by candles or lamps, hair occasionally caught fire when heated tools were brought too close to open flames. These incidents were rare, but severe, sometimes resulting in injuries far worse than scalp burns. Households that relied on servants to assist with styling faced additional risks, as cramped workspaces and low lighting increased the chance of misjudgment. When incidents occurred, those involved typically tried to manage the aftermath quietly to avoid embarrassment. Despite these hazards, social pressure encouraged the continuous use of heated tools. Appearances at social gatherings depended heavily on well-maintained hair, and women of status were expected to display consistent grooming regardless of personal cost. The discomfort associated with styling rarely deterred them. Even those who disliked the process accepted it as part of daily life. The expectation that women remain composed made it difficult to voice concerns about pain, injury, or long-term damage. Servants, tasked with heating and handling the devices, faced similar risks. Many lacked proper training and learned through observation, increasing the likelihood of mistakes. They worked with tools that reached temperatures capable of burning skin instantly. Blisters, cuts, and minor burns became part of their routine. These workers had even fewer opportunities to express discomfort, as their injuries carried no social weight. Their labor ensured that women of higher status could maintain appearances, yet the hazards they faced remained hidden from public consideration. The absence of regulation meant there were no guidelines regarding safety or proper tool design. Curling irons varied widely in size, thickness, and material. Some were made with poor quality metal that heated unevenly, creating hot spots capable of causing severe burns. Others retained heat for too long, making them difficult to control. Manufacturers focused on affordability rather than safety, and customers rarely questioned design flaws as long as the tools produced the desired appearance. Physicians occasionally noted the prevalence of burns and hair damage among their female patients, but the broader medical community did not consider these injuries significant. Discussions of women's health during the era rarely acknowledged the physical impact of beauty practices, leaving those affected with little support. Injuries were treated informally at home, often with remedies that provided minimal relief. Recovery depended largely on the individual's ability to tolerate discomfort while maintaining social expectations. Over time, the tension between appearance and well-being became an unspoken aspect of Victorian grooming. Women navigated daily life with tender scalps, damaged hair, and the memory of burns that never fully faded. Yet the standards that shaped their routines remained unchanged. The tools continued to be used, the procedures continued to be followed, and the risks remained embedded within the pursuit of beauty. As with many aspects of Victorian appearance, the polished results concealed the strain required to achieve them. Curls, held in place by intense heat, presented an image of refinement, even when the process left lasting marks. The visual outcome mattered more than the method, and this prioritization shaped the experiences of countless women whose discomfort remained silent. Heated tools shaped hairstyles that appeared controlled and refined, masking the physical strain they imposed during daily routines. Their widespread use revealed how expectations pushed women to accept injuries as ordinary. Within this pattern of endurance, another concealed burden begins to take form. Hair washing in the Victorian era was treated not as a routine step in daily hygiene, but as an occasional undertaking that required time, preparation, and resources many households could not spare. Weeks often passed between washings, and in some homes, the process occurred only a few times within a season. Water had to be heated manually, carried between rooms, and poured into basins large enough to accommodate long, heavy hair. Servants performed most of the labor, and the amount of effort involved made frequent washing impractical. As a result, hair accumulated oils, dust, and residue from styling products for long periods before being cleaned. Instead of regular washing, many relied on alternatives intended to freshen the hair without fully removing buildup. Rum, rosewater, and vinegar were applied as substitutes for soap or shampoo substances that were either unavailable or considered too harsh for delicate hair. These liquids offered temporary fragrance, masking the odors created by infrequent washing. They did little to dissolve dirt or remove residues from pomades and waxes. The scalp remained coated, and the smell of alcohol or diluted floral scent lingered only until natural oils overpowered them again. Women accepted these limitations because more thorough methods required labor and resources beyond what most could justify. The structure of Victorian homes also made frequent washing inconvenient. Plumbing was limited, especially outside wealthier districts, and water often had to be retrieved from wells, pumps, or shared facilities. Heating large amounts of water requires time and fuel, making the process expensive. Families reserved such efforts for bathing the body, which they considered a higher priority. Hair, viewed as a separate and more delicate part of grooming, received attention only when necessary. The result was a routine in which washing became an event rather than a habit. Those who worked as personal attendants for wealthy women understood the complexity of preparing for a wash. They combed through tangled strands beforehand, removing debris and loosening knots to prevent breakage during washing. The task took patience, especially when the hair had not been cleaned for several weeks. Once washing began, attendants poured the heated water, slowly massaging the scalp to lift surface grime. Soaps made specifically for hair were uncommon, so they relied on diluted mixtures of household ingredients that produced minimal lather. After rinsing drying, the hair became another challenge. Without modern tools, drying required hours of exposure to indoor heat or sunlight, and women often remained seated for most of the day until their hair returned to a manageable state. The length and thickness of Victorian hairstyles further complicated the process. Long hair absorbed large amounts of water, making it heavy and difficult to handle when wet. Women avoided washing too frequently because the drying process disrupted their schedules and left them unable to participate in social activities. Once the hair was finally dry, restyling it demanded even more time, including curling, combing, and arranging it into the desired shape. This cycle reinforced the perception that washing was a luxury rather than a standard part of hygiene. As time passed between washes, the residue from styling products accumulated. Pomades made from animal fat blended with perfumes hardened near the roots, trapping dust and contributing to a persistent heaviness. Vinegar and rosewater treatments could not remove these substances, so they remained on the scalp until the next full wash. Many women experienced itching or discomfort as the buildup increased, but tolerated the sensation as an expected part of grooming. Complaints about scalp irritation seldom received attention because they were so widespread. The odors associated with unwashed hair varied depending on the products used. Some women relied heavily on scented pomades, which produced a mix of fragrance and natural oil that gradually turned sour. Others applied alcohol-based solutions that evaporated quickly, offering only a brief period of freshness. In crowded gatherings, the combined presence of these scents created a layered atmosphere that reflected the limited nature of personal hygiene at the time. Those who stood close enough might notice, but politeness discouraged any mention of it. Medical professionals occasionally addressed the consequences of infrequent washing, noting the prevalence of scalp issues such as dandruff, inflammation, or minor fungal infections. However, treatment options were limited, and societal norms kept the subject private. Many women believed that washing too often weakened the hair or caused illness, ideas reinforced by cultural traditions and limited scientific understanding. These beliefs further reduced the likelihood of adopting more frequent washing practices, leaving most households committed to the established routine. For families without servants, the process was even more difficult. Women who had to prepare their own water and wash their own hair faced physical strain and time constraints that made regular washing nearly impossible. They adapted by braiding their hair tightly or pinning it in ways that concealed buildup. In these homes, hair washing was performed only when necessary, and even then, the results provided limited relief from the underlying issues caused by prolonged neglect. The tendency to hide these challenges contributed to the perception that Victorian hair was naturally clean and well kept. Paintings, fashion plates, and written descriptions emphasized appearance without acknowledging the labor or infrequency behind the scenes. The contrast between representation and reality created expectations that many women struggled to meet. Their attempts to maintain appearances through fragrance rather than cleanliness reflected the broader pattern of prioritizing outward presentation over physical comfort. The more closely one examines these routines, the clearer the underlying strain becomes. Hair washing that might seem simple today required significant effort in Victorian households, making it a practice reserved for those with time, resources, or assistance. The illusion of cleanliness depended on scented liquids rather than effective hygiene, leaving women to manage discomfort quietly while maintaining a polished exterior. The long intervals between washings preserved the appearance of routine while concealing the discomfort caused by build-up and limited hygiene. These practices revealed how daily grooming relied more on concealment than true cleanliness. Within these patterns of maintenance, another layer of expectation begins to appear. Voluminous Victorian hairstyles demanded structural support that significantly altered the physical experience of those who wore them. Many women relied on combinations of hairpieces, padding, and intricate arrangements that added considerable weight to the head. The finished styles appeared balanced and elegant, yet beneath the surface they imposed steady pressure on the neck and upper spine. Hours spent holding this weight resulted in stiffness, fatigue, and a feeling of heaviness that persisted even after the hairstyle was removed. Maintaining composure while carrying these structures required endurance, especially during long social gatherings. The complexity of these hairstyles made them difficult to adjust once completed. Women attended events knowing that shifting the hair or attempting to relieve tension could damage the arrangement. The inability to move freely created a constant awareness of the weight they carried. Many stood or sat carefully, avoiding sudden turns or bending their necks too far. Even minor misalignments could destabilize the structure, making it necessary to maintain strict posture throughout the evening. These limitations shaped how women interacted with their surroundings, influencing gestures, movements, and expressions in subtle but persistent ways. During crowded events such as balls or formal dinners, the cumulative strain of heavy hairstyles increased. The pressure on the scalp intensified as hours passed, and the tight pins used to secure hairpieces created additional discomfort. Some women experienced headaches that began as a mild ache but grew sharper as the night continued. Others felt dizzy when attempting to move too quickly or when rising from their seats. Without the option to remove or adjust their hairstyles, they simply endured the discomfort, waiting for the moment when they could return home. Fainting was not uncommon. In rooms that were warm, poorly ventilated, or filled with candle smoke, the combination of heat-restricted posture and heavy hairstyles pushed many women beyond their limits. When fainting occurred, attendants or companions helped them away from the crowd, offering temporary relief before they resumed their public roles. These incidents were frequently attributed to delicate health or emotional sensitivity, but the weight of elaborate hairstyles was often a significant contributing factor. Such episodes were seldom discussed openly because acknowledging the physical burden conflicted with expectations of refinement. Women from wealthy households experienced similar discomfort during private routines. Preparing for social events required sitting for long periods, while stylists assembled the hairstyle. As layers of hairpieces, padding, and pins accumulated, the emerging structure altered the angle of the wearer's head, forcing the neck to compensate. By the time the style was complete, the woman often felt a tension that would persist until the hairstyle was dismantled hours later. These sensations became part of the routine, accepted without question, because the final appearance held greater social importance than physical ease. Servants who assisted in maintaining these hairstyles observed the physical strain, but had little opportunity to address it. Their responsibilities focused on precision and efficiency, ensuring the hairstyle remained intact. They noticed when women winced from pressure or rubbed the back of their necks discreetly, yet they continued their work without comment. The hierarchy within the household discouraged any suggestion that a hairstyle might be too demanding. The expectation that beauty required endurance influenced everyone involved in the process. The materials used to support these hairstyles added to the burden. Frames made of wire or fabric padding were inserted beneath layers of hair to create height or volume. These structures needed to be sturdy enough to hold their shape, and their weight varied depending on design. Once secured, they pressed against the scalp, causing localized discomfort that intensified over time. As the evening progressed, women felt the distinct pressure of these supports, yet removing them was not an option until they were in private. The physical strain associated with these hairstyles did not end when the accessories were removed. Many women experienced lingering soreness in the muscles of the neck and shoulders, which sometimes lasted into the following day. Sleeping after a long event could be uncomfortable due to the residual tension. Despite these effects, the routines did not change. The expectation to appear polished in public remained constant, reinforcing the need to accept the discomfort as part of daily life. Even those who preferred simpler styles faced pressure to conform. Social environments emphasized appearance, and deviation from accepted standards could attract attention or criticism. As a result, women chose elaborate hairstyles, even when they understood the physical cost. Graceful presentation remained the priority, and the strain beneath it stayed invisible to most observers. The polished exterior concealed the effort required to maintain it, ensuring that the discomfort remained a personal burden rather than a shared concern. The cumulative experience of these routines shaped how women approached social participation. They planned their movements, carefully gauged their stamina during events, and learned to manage the gradual increase in discomfort that accompanied heavy hairstyles. The expectations of the era left little room for alternatives, making endurance a central aspect of their daily lives. The appearance of ease was maintained through quiet determination, even when the physical demands felt overwhelming. As one considers the extent of this strain, it becomes clear that many women navigated their public lives while carrying physical burdens that went unacknowledged. The insistence on elaborate hairstyles created a system in which discomfort was normalized and rarely questioned. The elegant results did not reflect the effort or pain required to achieve them, leaving the reality of these routines concealed beneath layers of carefully arranged hair. Heavy hairstyles shaped public appearances while imposing a physical burden that remained largely unspoken. Their widespread acceptance revealed how beauty standards prioritized outward composure over comfort. As this expectation solidifies, another form of strain begins to rise quietly. Combs made from silver, copper, or other dense metals became common grooming tools among Victorian women because they were durable, visually refined, and considered appropriate for maintaining long hair. Their solid construction gave them a sense of elegance, but the weight of these instruments created notable strain during daily use. When pulled through thick or tangled hair, the metal teeth caught tightly, dragging along the scalp with a force that caused discomfort. Repeated strokes increased the likelihood of breakage, while the edges of the teeth left small scratches that often went unnoticed until irritation appeared later. These tools were designed with appearance in mind rather than comfort or safety. The interaction between metal and hair created additional complications. Metal combs did not glide smoothly, especially when hair carried residue from pomades or accumulated oils. As users attempted to detangle sections, resistance built along the strands, generating friction that led to knots rather than removing them. The pressure needed to force the comb through these areas caused brief but sharp pain. Many women experienced this daily, yet they continued using the tools because alternatives were limited and less socially favored. Wooden or bone combs existed, but metal combs conveyed status, making them the preferred choice in many households despite the discomfort. These combs also reacted to the environment in ways that contributed to potential hazards. When used near fireplaces, lamps, or heated curling tools, the metal absorbed warmth quickly. A comb left momentarily beside a heat source could become unpleasantly hot without the user noticing until it touched the scalp. In some cases, the sudden transfer of heat caused redness or mild burns that took days to fade. Women accustomed to working near open flames during grooming learned to handle their tools cautiously, yet accidents still occurred, especially in crowded or dimly lit spaces. Static electricity posed another issue. As metal combs moved repeatedly through dry hair, especially in colder months, they generated charges that caused strands to lift or cling unpredictably. The sensation startled some users, and the resulting tangle required additional combing to correct. What seemed like a minor inconvenience added time and frustration to grooming routines that were already lengthy. These small disruptions accumulated, reinforcing the idea that maintaining Victorian hairstyles demanded patience and tolerance for physical discomfort. The scalp endured the deepest impact. Repeated scraping from metal combs created microscopic abrasions that exposed the skin to irritation. Over time, these abrasions sometimes led to inflammation around the hair follicles. Women described tenderness or soreness when pressing near the roots, sensations that intensified when hair was styled tightly. In more severe cases, persistent irritation contributed to thinning or localized hair loss. Yet these symptoms seldom received attention because they developed gradually and were considered part of the normal strain of grooming. Servants who assisted with grooming witnessed these effects frequently. They brushed and combed hair for extended periods, following instructions that prioritized appearance rather than comfort. Their tasks required pulling metal combs through long strands repeatedly, and they observed when women winced or shifted slightly in response to discomfort. Despite this, the routine remained unchanged, because presenting well-ordered hair at social events outweighed concerns about pain. Servants themselves sometimes used similar tools on their own hair, experiencing the same irritation but lacking the resources to seek alternatives. Metal combs also wear down over time, teeth bent or dulled with repeated use, creating uneven edges that caught hair more aggressively. Some combs developed small imperfections that scraped the scalp unexpectedly. Replacement was possible for wealthier households, but many continued using worn combs until they became noticeably ineffective. The decline in quality increased the likelihood of injury and made grooming sessions longer and more difficult. Despite these drawbacks, the popularity of metal combs persisted because they aligned with ideals of refinement. They appeared in portraits, dressing tables, and gift sets, reinforcing their role as markers of taste. Their polished surfaces and decorative engravings gave the impression of sophistication even as their daily use caused discomfort. The contrast between their aesthetic appeal and the physical strain they imposed mirrored broader patterns in Victorian beauty practices, where outward elegance often concealed underlying difficulty. Women adapted to these routines by developing techniques to minimize pain. Some parted their hair in ways that made combing easier, while others applied more pomade to reduce tangling. These adjustments offered limited relief. The underlying issue, the rigidity and weight of the combs, remained unchanged. As grooming standards continued to shape social expectations, women accepted these challenges as part of presenting themselves properly. The routine became a quiet demonstration of endurance rather than comfort. The cumulative impact of these tools extended into daily life. Redness along the hairline, soreness when lying down, and a lingering tightness around the scalp became familiar sensations. These signs of strain were rarely shared openly. Grooming was considered a private matter, and discussing discomfort risked drawing unwanted attention to the effort required to maintain one's appearance. The silence surrounding these experiences allowed the use of metal combs to continue unchallenged. Observing these routines reveals how essential grooming tools contributed to the hidden discomfort woven into Victorian beauty culture. The combs were symbols of refinement, yet their practical effects contradicted the elegance they represented. Their persistent use demonstrated how appearance was valued above ease, creating daily experiences shaped by quiet physical strain. Metal combs created a polished appearance, while placing steady pressure on the scalp each time they were used. Their acceptance showed how grooming prioritized results over comfort. Over time, another pattern of hidden discomfort begins to reveal itself. Victorian mourning customs extended deeply into personal grooming and household decoration, creating practices that merged memory with physical remnants of the deceased. Among these customs, the use of hair taken from loved ones after death became a familiar part of many households. Families commissioned artisans to shape these strands into bracelets, brooches, lockets, and frame designs meant to preserve a connection with the person who had passed away. These objects were displayed or worn with quiet solemnity, treated not as unusual curiosities, but as recognizable symbols of grief and remembrance. The presence of such items reflected the era's close relationship with death and the desire to keep a part of the deceased within daily life. The transformation of hair into ornaments required delicate work. Artisans sorted the strands, cleaned them lightly, and arranged them into patterns that suited the object being made. Some designs were simple, consisting of tightly woven braids that looped around a clasp or pendant. Others were elaborate, forming floral shapes or intricate scrolls enclosed behind glass. These pieces varied in appearance, yet all shared the same origin: hair, cut from someone at their most vulnerable moment, often shortly after death. Families believed the objects helped preserve memory, but the process also introduced another layer of complexity into how hair functioned within Victorian society. Many individuals kept these mementos with them throughout their lives. Some women wore bracelets or lockets containing their mother's hair, believing the presence of the object offered comfort during periods of absence or personal difficulty. The practice became normalized within social circles, and wearing mourning hair did not attract judgment. Instead, it signaled devotion to family, respect for tradition, and acceptance of the emotional weight that accompanied loss. These pieces continued to be worn long after the period of mourning had passed, integrating the ritual into ordinary routines. The production of framed hair art represented another aspect of this custom. Families displayed these pieces in living rooms, bedrooms, or hallways, allowing the hair of the deceased to become part of the household environment. The designs ranged from modest arrangements to intricate patterns that required significant time to assemble. Visitors who observed these frames often recognized their meaning immediately. They served as reminders not only of the individual who had died, but also of the cultural expectations surrounding grief. While the presence of human hair in domestic spaces might seem unusual now, it aligned with Victorian beliefs about memory, legacy, and the physical connection between the living and the dead. Despite the emotional significance attached to these items, the use of hair from the deceased introduced complicated physical considerations. Hair removed after death could carry residue from oils, environmental exposure, or the conditions of the final days of life. When not cleaned thoroughly, it retained traces of these elements. Artisans who handled the hair faced the possibility of encountering materials that had not been sanitized. Although the risk of illness from handling hair alone was relatively low, the practice reflected a broader trend in Victorian grooming culture, in which the origins and condition of hair received limited attention. The focus remained on aesthetics and symbolism, rather than safety. The objects created from mourning hair were often preserved for decades. As they aged, the strands sometimes loosened, shedding small fibers that accumulated in display cases or on clothing. These changes rarely prompted concern, as families valued the sentimental connection more than the physical condition of the item. The gradual deterioration of such pieces became part of their history, reinforcing the idea that they were meant to withstand time, even as their structure weakened. Some individuals took the practice further by incorporating mourning hair into daily grooming routines. A few wore small additions of a loved one's hair, integrated into their own hairstyles, believing this kept the deceased close in a literal sense. These additions were subtle, blending with natural hair and remaining unnoticed by casual observers. The emotional significance outweighed any concerns about hygiene or long-term preservation. The integration of mourning hair into personal appearance demonstrated how deeply the era intertwined sentiment with physical form. The broader cultural acceptance of these practices was shaped by the Victorian preoccupation with death and remembrance. High mortality rates, especially among children, made loss a familiar experience across all social classes. The creation of mourning hairpieces allowed individuals to express grief within socially acceptable boundaries while adhering to structured rituals. These pieces became part of the language of mourning, signaling emotional states that Victorian society expected individuals to navigate carefully. Artisans who specialized in this craft benefited from the demand for personalized mourning objects. They worked quietly, often from small workshops, receiving orders from families who wished to memorialize loved ones in tangible form. Their work required precision and patience, yet they seldom disclosed the details of their craft to outsiders. The privacy surrounding the process mirrored the private nature of grief itself, allowing the objects to carry personal meaning without inviting broader scrutiny. Observing these customs reveals how Victorian society approached death with a mixture of practicality and sentiment. Hair, durable and resistant to decay, provided a physical link that families felt compelled to preserve. The presence of mourning hairpieces in daily life demonstrated how deeply these traditions influenced personal identity and household space. They served as constant reminders of loss, yet they also represented continuity within families who faced frequent encounters with death. While these customs might appear unsettling today, they were embedded in a framework of expectations that shaped every stage of life. Mourning hairpieces reflected not only affection, but also social obligation. Wearing them signaled adherence to cultural norms, respect for the dead, and acknowledgement of collective experiences shaped by mortality. Mourning hairpieces blended personal sentiment with physical reminders of loss, becoming part of daily routines rather than rare curiosities. Their presence showed how grief shaped grooming practices and household environments in subtle but persistent ways. As time deepens these rituals, another influence connected to appearance begins to surface quietly. Victorian beauty standards place significant emphasis on women's hair, turning it into a visible marker of morality, social position, and personal discipline. These expectations shaped daily life in ways that extended far beyond appearance. Long hair was widely regarded as a symbol of femininity and respectability, and women who did not conform to this ideal risked being judged as improper or unfeminine. The social pressure to maintain length and fullness made hair an unavoidable part of how women were evaluated. Even those who preferred practicality or simplicity found themselves adhering to norms that left little room for personal preference. Short hair carried particularly strong associations. Women who cut their hair were viewed with suspicion, as though their decision reflected a deeper rejection of established values. In many households, short hair suggested instability, rebellion, or a lack of self-restraint. These assumptions created obstacles for women who wished to make choices based on comfort or necessity. Illness, work, or changing personal circumstances rarely provided enough justification to avoid criticism. The expectation that hair remain long and well-kept limited autonomy, reinforcing an image of femininity that depended on compliance rather than individuality. Widowed women faced even stricter regulations. Mourning customs required them to adopt subdued hairstyles, often pulling their hair back tightly and covering it with dark veils or caps. These styles signaled their status publicly, marking them as individuals in extended periods of grief. While the intention was to reflect respect for the deceased, the practice also imposed restrictions that shaped behavior and appearance long after immediate mourning had ended. Women remained bound by these expectations for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives, even when they wished to resume ordinary grooming routines. Their hair became a visible reminder of personal loss and social obligation. The regulations surrounding widows' hair served not only as symbols of grief, but also as mechanisms of control. The subdued hairstyles limited self-expression and reinforced the idea that a woman's identity remained tied to her marital status. These expectations carried emotional weight. Many widows navigated their daily lives with the quiet understanding that deviation from the prescribed appearance might prompt criticism from neighbors, relatives, or religious communities. The constant awareness of public judgment influenced their choices, shaping how they presented themselves regardless of personal feelings. Beyond mourning practices, everyday standards for women's hair reinforced broader societal patterns. The emphasis on length required extensive care, yet alternatives, such as cutting or simplifying, were discouraged. Women spent considerable time maintaining their hair, not only because they desired a polished appearance, but also because they understood the consequences of failing to meet expectations. A woman whose hair appeared unkempt or insufficiently styled might be perceived as careless, unhealthy, or lacking discipline. These assumptions affected how she was treated socially, limiting opportunities and influencing how others interpreted her character. In many households, the grooming of hair reflected underlying power dynamics. Husbands and family members often expressed preferences that women felt compelled to follow. Long hair was described as desirable, modest, or appropriate, reinforcing the belief that adhering to these expectations strengthened social harmony. Women who wished to adopt different styles found themselves negotiating between personal comfort and external judgment. Even small deviations could provoke criticism, prompting many to remain within the boundaries set by tradition. These standards influenced younger women as well. Girls grew up learning that hair represented more than personal appearance. They were taught that keeping hair long and tidy demonstrated obedience and alignment with social norms. Cutting it was rarely considered an acceptable option, and those who attempted to do so faced pressure to reverse their choices. The messages passed down through families and communities ensured that the expectations continued across generations, shaping identity from an early age. Women working in public roles or domestic service faced additional scrutiny. Employers often included guidelines for hair in their expectations, requiring certain styles deemed appropriate for their positions. These requirements reinforced class distinctions and perpetuated the idea that women's hair reflected their worth and capability. Even outside formal employment, the pressure to maintain socially approved hairstyles remained constant, affecting how women navigated both private and public spaces. The consequences of these norms extended into emotional and psychological realms. Many women experienced a persistent awareness of being observed and evaluated based on something as personal as their hair. This scrutiny shaped how they moved through social environments, contributing to a sense of vigilance that persisted throughout their lives. The need to meet expectations created tension between self-expression and conformity, leaving women with limited opportunities to explore alternatives without facing judgment. Despite these pressures, the standards remained relatively unchallenged during the Victorian era. The consistency with which they were enforced reflected a broader cultural acceptance that tied beauty to compliance. Women internalized these values through repetition and social reinforcement, shaping their sense of identity around expectations that prioritized appearance over autonomy. The quiet endurance with which they navigated these constraints reveals how deeply the standards influenced daily life. Examining these customs shows how grooming was not simply a matter of aesthetic preference, but a reflection of social expectations that defined acceptable behavior. Women's hair became a tangible representation of their adherence to prescribed roles. The implication was clear: maintaining approved hairstyles demonstrated willingness to conform, while deviation carried consequences. These patterns of control embedded themselves into the fabric of daily life, reinforcing norms through both subtle and explicit pressures. Hair standards shaped women's identities while limiting the choices they felt free to make. Their routines reflected a system in which appearance became a measure of acceptance, with each expectation reinforcing the next. Another layer of regulated beauty begins to take form. Hairstyling products in the Victorian era introduced chemical substances into daily routines long before their effects were understood. Many sprays, powders, and fixatives contained compounds such as chlorine, ammonia, and sulfur, chosen for their ability to stiffen hair, preserve curls, or mask odors that accumulated after weeks without washing. These substances clung to the air the moment they were released, filling rooms with a dense chemical presence that lingered far longer than the styling session itself. Women inhaled these fumes regularly, often without realizing how deeply they penetrated the lungs or how long they remained trapped in the confined spaces where grooming typically occurred. Most households performed styling in bedrooms or dressing rooms that relied on minimal ventilation. Windows were kept closed during cold seasons, and heavy curtains blocked drafts to maintain warmth. When sprays or powders were applied in these enclosed environments, the concentration of airborne chemicals increased rapidly. Women sitting still for grooming absorbed the fumes, with every breath experiencing lightheadedness or a wave of nausea that they rarely attributed to the products themselves. These reactions became familiar enough that they blended into the background of daily life, treated as momentary discomfort rather than early signs of respiratory strain. The composition of these styling products contributed directly to their impact. Ammonia offered a sharp scent that cut through the smell of pomade and unwashed hair, but its vapors irritated the eyes and nasal passages almost immediately. Chlorine compounds adhered to hair to create firmness, yet they also produced fumes that displaced fresh air in small rooms. Sulfur-based powders attempted to reduce odor while absorbing oil, but they left behind particles that entered the lungs when disturbed. The use of these substances was not regulated, and manufacturers prioritized effectiveness over safety. Consumers accepted the resulting discomfort because they valued the appearance that these products enabled. Grooming sessions involving multiple applications created especially heavy atmospheres. Sprays sealed curls, powders set the base, and additional layers were applied as the hairstyle took shape. Each step added new chemicals to the air, intensifying the effect. Women sometimes paused to steady themselves, feeling a sudden heaviness in their chest or a faint blurring of their surroundings. These sensations did not halt the routine. Beauty standards encouraged endurance, and the final appearance mattered more than the fleeting pressure felt during preparation. Those who already had sensitive airways experienced more severe reactions. Some developed chronic coughing or found themselves short of breath after prolonged exposure. In certain households, repeated inhalation led to symptoms resembling asthma, making daily grooming increasingly difficult. These individuals often believed they were developing new illnesses or suffering from natural weakness, unaware of the role their hair products played in shaping their condition. Medical understanding of chemical inhalation at the time was minimal, and physicians seldom connected respiratory problems to grooming habits. Loss of smell occurred in some cases. Continuous exposure to strong chemicals dulled the senses gradually, making it difficult to detect subtler fragrances or changes in the environment. A woman who styled her hair regularly might notice that familiar scents faded over months, yet she rarely associated this shift with the products she used. The decline happened slowly enough to remain unnoticed until it became permanent. These changes did not attract public attention, because the experiences were personal and private, confined to domestic spaces that excluded outside scrutiny. Servants responsible for applying these products faced even greater exposure. They held bottles, brushed powders, and stood closest to the women they styled. Their work placed them inside the densest pockets of fumes, often for extended periods. Many endured persistent irritation in the throat or chest, yet they continued with their tasks because refusing was not an option. Their health concerns remained unspoken, overshadowed by social hierarchy and the expectation that they maintain efficiency, regardless of discomfort. The accumulation of chemicals in household air created long-term effects on the environment as well. Powders settled on furniture, fabrics, and carpets, releasing particles whenever touched or disturbed. Rooms where grooming took place often retained a noticeable sharpness in the air, though residents adapted to it over time. The lingering presence of these substances reinforced how deeply styling practices shaped the domestic atmosphere, extending beyond the few minutes during which products were applied. Despite the physical consequences, the use of chemical styling products continued because alternatives did not produce the same visual results. Women valued the ability to maintain curls or smoothness for long hours, especially during social events. The discomfort experienced while preparing for these occasions seemed minor when compared to the expectations placed upon them. Their willingness to tolerate the effects reflected a broader pattern in which beauty standards overshadowed health concerns. Observing these practices reveals how grooming routines quietly introduced chemical exposure into everyday life. The products fulfilled their intended purpose, but carried hidden costs that affected breathing senses and overall comfort. The gradual nature of these effects made them difficult to recognize, allowing the routines to persist without challenge. The emphasis on controlled, polished appearances ensured that the risks remained secondary to the visible outcome. Chemical styling products shaped the air women breathed, creating routines that quietly affected their health long before the consequences were understood. Their continued use showed how appearance took precedence over physical comfort. At the edge of these practices, another form of subtle harm begins to develop. Victorian beauty culture required women to maintain their appearance through routines that accumulated strain quietly over time. The effort placed into creating polished hairstyles demanded endurance that became an expected part of daily life. Many women began each morning with a sense of obligation rather than anticipation, knowing that the hours ahead would involve pressure on the scalp, discomfort from tightly arranged hair, and the lingering effects of styling tools, products. These physical experiences formed the foundation of what society labeled as beauty, yet the strain remained largely unspoken. Pain became a routine companion. Tight braids pulled at the roots, hairpieces added weight that pressed against tendons and pins, anchored styles with a rigidity that left tender spots behind the ears or along the crown. Women learned to sit still through these sensations, adjusting their posture to reduce the pull or ease the pressure when possible. The discomfort felt during styling sessions continued throughout the day, influencing movements and posture, while remaining hidden behind a composed exterior. Because the discomfort was so common, it rarely prompted concern or sympathy. Instead, it became another quiet expectation placed on women. Daily grooming required patience, but it also required silence. Speaking openly about pain risked inviting criticism or being perceived as weak. Women understood that complaining achieved little, as the standards themselves remained unchanged. Those who wished to maintain their social standing accepted these routines as requirements. The burden of maintaining beauty did not include opportunities to question or resist. It relied on compliance and continuity. The more consistently women endured these routines, the more deeply society embedded the expectation that beauty must be maintained regardless of personal cost. The appearance of ease was itself part of the expectation. Women were expected to move gracefully, even when hairstyles limited their range of motion or caused persistent tension. Social gatherings required calm expressions that concealed the discomfort caused by weighty curls or tightly pinned arrangements. These gatherings further reinforced the disconnect between outward beauty and the physical demands that supported it. A woman who showed signs of strain risked undermining the appearance she had meticulously prepared. As a result, many navigated their social environments with calculated restraint, adjusting their movements to minimize pain while maintaining an image of composure. Social pressure amplified these expectations. A woman's appearance reflected not only her dedication to grooming, but also the reputation of her household. Family members, especially husbands or older relatives, often commented on the importance of presenting oneself properly. These comments reminded women that beauty was not merely personal, it represented a contribution to social harmony. This mindset reduced the space available for personal choice. Instead, beauty became a responsibility to fulfill rather than an option to explore. Even when women recognized the toll these routines took on their bodies, alternatives were limited. Cutting hair short or simplifying styles risked attracting judgment or being perceived as improper. Maintaining natural hair without enhancements was rarely acceptable for formal occasions. As a result, women continued their routines, despite knowing the strain involved. Their silence reflected an understanding that questioning the standards carried consequences that extended beyond appearance. Servants observed these dynamics closely. They witnessed moments when women winced during styling, or paused to steady themselves under the weight of elaborate arrangements. Despite this awareness, their role required them to continue their tasks without offering commentary. Their participation reinforced the structure that kept these beauty standards intact. They fulfilled the expectations of their position, even when doing so meant contributing to the discomfort of those they served. Their own experiences with grooming often reflected similar strain, though they lacked the resources or social support to mitigate it. The cumulative effects of these routines shaped women's long-term health. Persistent traction led to thinning hair, inflammation around the roots, and sensitivity along the scalp. Some experienced chronic headaches or neck pain linked directly to the physical demands of their hairstyles. These symptoms developed gradually and were rarely connected explicitly to grooming because the expectations normalized the discomfort. The familiarity of strain made it difficult for many to imagine alternatives, leaving them to navigate the gradual deterioration without understanding its cause. The unspoken burden of beauty extended beyond the physical realm. Women learned to internalize the expectation that discomfort was simply part of fulfilling their role. This mindset shaped how they approached other aspects of life, reinforcing patterns of endurance and quiet compliance. The routines surrounding hair became a small but constant reminder of the broader expectations that governed their behavior. The discipline required to maintain these standards reflected the discipline expected in other social duties. What remains most striking is how thoroughly these routines blended into daily life. The pain and strain became so deeply embedded that they rarely disrupted the rhythm of the day. Women moved through their responsibilities, carrying silent reminders of the standards they upheld. Their endurance supported a system that valued appearance above comfort, shaping the rhythm of their lives with demands that remained largely invisible. Beauty routines demanded persistence that overshadowed the discomfort embedded in every step. Women continued these practices because the social weight attached to appearance left them little room to choose otherwise. Beneath this quiet endurance, another expectation tied to changing trends begins to unfold. Trends in Victorian hairstyling shifted frequently, creating a constant sense of expectation that shaped the daily lives of women across social classes. Each decade introduced a new form, new volume, or new arrangement that quickly became a requirement rather than an option. Women who wished to maintain their position in society understood that keeping pace with these changes was not about preference, but about preserving the appearance that others expected from them. These trends shaped routines, purchases, and even relationships, forming an invisible current that influenced nearly every aspect of a woman's life. The pressure to adapt intensified as styles grew more elaborate. A woman who failed to follow the newest arrangement risked being viewed as indifferent or careless, even if her daily life left little time for experimentation. Magazines circulated illustrations of current hairstyles, reinforcing the idea that beauty required constant updating. Artists emphasized smooth surfaces, perfect curves, and balanced structures that rarely reflected the realities of daily wear. Yet these images set the standard, and many women measured their success by how closely they approached the ideal presented on those pages. This constant evolution demanded attention and resources. Women spent increasing amounts of time preparing their hair each morning, adjusting shapes and proportions to reflect the current trend. Hairdressers gained influence as trends became more complex, and many households employed individuals responsible solely for maintaining these styles. Those without access to such assistance worked patiently to achieve similar results on their own, often devoting hours to the task, even when the outcome remained uncertain. The need to keep up with these changes became a routine expectation, regardless of personal preference or physical discomfort. The pace of change also reinforced social distinctions. Wealthier women could update their styles more easily because they had greater access to tools, accessories, and professional assistance. This allowed them to adopt new trends almost immediately. Women with fewer resources faced greater challenges. They often used older tools or improvised materials to approximate the preferred shapes, yet the results were rarely identical. The difference, though subtle at times, marked a visible boundary between social levels. Observers noticed such distinctions, quickly reinforcing the idea that appearance served as a form of public record. Many women experienced a sense of fatigue as they adjusted to each new standard. Just as they mastered one arrangement, another began circulating among the elite. The rhythm of change made it difficult to feel satisfied with any particular style. Even when a woman invested significant time perfecting a look, she knew its relevance would fade quickly. This cycle limited opportunities for personal expression, since individual choice held less importance than alignment with the prevailing form. The need to remain current overshadowed any desire to establish a consistent or comfortable style. The effect extended beyond appearance. These shifting trends influenced posture, movement, and daily habits. Some styles added height that required careful balance. Others incorporated weights that encouraged rigid positioning. Still, others relied on materials that made certain actions difficult, such as leaning back or turning the head quickly. Women adjusted their routines to accommodate these changes, sometimes avoiding physical activity that risked unsettling the structure they had worked so diligently to create. The pressure to maintain a current appearance thus shaped both the beginning and end of each day. The emotional effect accumulated quietly. Many women internalized the expectation that they must always prepare to adjust their appearance whenever the social landscape shifted. This expectation contributed to a sense of vigilance that extended beyond grooming. The awareness that judgment followed visible details created a mental routine as steady as the physical ones. Even when a woman understood that trends shifted arbitrarily, she accepted them because ignoring them risked social consequences. Some embraced these changes as opportunities to display dedication, while others treated them as obligations that grew heavier with time. Yet regardless of personal feelings, most continued without interruption. Their participation supported a system that rewarded adherence and discouraged deviation, making the cycle self-sustaining. The more women complied, the stronger the expectation became, shaping the culture in ways that persisted through generation after generation. These rapid shifts also contributed to a broader sense of instability. While clothing etiquette and household roles often remained consistent, hairstyles changed with unusual speed, creating an area of life where certainty rarely lasted. Women balanced this instability with routine, returning each day to familiar tasks while preparing to adjust whenever new illustrations or recommendations emerged. Their endurance reflected a quiet acceptance of change that was neither celebrated nor questioned, simply observed and followed. In the end, the cycle of evolving hairstyles created an atmosphere in which beauty became an ongoing pursuit rather than a completed task. A woman's efforts remained visible only briefly before new expectations emerged. This unending rhythm shaped her sense of self, her schedule, and her interactions with others, leaving little room for rest from the demand to remain current. Each shift in fashion tightened the expectation that women must adapt, no matter how exhausting the pace became. This pattern continued because maintaining a current appearance carried more weight than the desire for comfort. Another layer of pressure rises when these routines expand into formal training and household instruction. Training institutions dedicated to hairstyling emerged as Victorian expectations grew more demanding, particularly within households that relied heavily on precision and consistency. These schools existed to prepare attendants, ensuring they could complete each grooming task exactly as their employers required. The focus was not on creativity, but on accuracy, repetition, and a reliable understanding of every step needed to produce a respectable appearance. Women of higher status depended on these trained attendants to maintain the hairstyles that reflected their place in society. The training process emphasized discipline above all else. Attendants learned how to handle hair with steady hands, how to prepare materials in a specific order, and how to construct forms that held their shape throughout the day. A single lapse could lead to embarrassment for the employer, so students repeated the same routine countless times until their instructors judged their work acceptable. These routines became a kind of ritual, carried out with the same movements and the same pace each morning. Historical documents describe instructional sequences that sometimes included as many as 20 steps before a hairstyle could be considered complete. Each step had a purpose, detangling, smoothing, applying oils, shaping volumes, securing pins, adjusting symmetry, and performing final checks. The length of these routines reflected the extent to which appearance was treated as a structured duty rather than a personal preference. Attendants followed the steps silently, knowing that their performance influenced their employer's reputation. Some households demanded even more precision than the standard curriculum offered. Families of higher rank often sought attendants trained in Paris, where hairstyling techniques were considered superior. French instructors known for strict teaching methods emphasized exact measurements and meticulous layering. They viewed hairstyling as a disciplined craft, one that left no room for improvisation. Households that hired these attendants signaled their commitment to maintaining standards that matched elite European expectations. The training environment itself carried an atmosphere of quiet pressure. The rooms were often sparse, lit with steady natural light to expose imperfections in the work. Chairs were arranged in long rows, each holding a practice mannequin, or in some cases, a student who volunteered to allow classmates to train on real hair. Instructors monitored every angle, correcting even minor flaws. The steady repetition created a rhythm that echoed the seriousness with which hair was treated in Victorian society. For many attendants, completion of this training represented both an opportunity and a responsibility. Their skills granted them access to prestigious households, where their work affected daily routines, from morning preparations to evening gatherings. Yet the responsibility weighed on them, because failure, even something as simple as uneven smoothing, could lead to punishment or dismissal. Their presence in the household remained secure only as long as their work met expectations without error. The demands of the role extended beyond technical skill. Attendants needed to anticipate their employer's preferences, understand how the weather might affect a hairstyle, and adjust techniques depending on the condition of the hair. They also needed to maintain emotional composure, since rushing or showing frustration could disrupt the delicate balance required to achieve the desired result. Silence was common during these sessions, as both parties understood the seriousness of the task. The structure of these institutions reflected a broader expectation that grooming should appear effortless, even though it required extensive hidden labor. Employers rarely acknowledged the work behind their appearance. Their hairstyles were presented publicly as natural extensions of elegance, not as the outcome of hours of preparation by trained attendants. This separation created a quiet distance between the visible beauty and the unseen effort responsible for producing it. The role of the attendant also extended into the household hierarchy. Their presence during intimate routines positioned them uniquely within the domestic structure. They witnessed the beginning of each day, the exhaustion of late evenings, and the unguarded states that followed long public events. Yet their role required them to remain silent, observers performing tasks without comment and leaving no trace of personal presence behind. Their identity was defined entirely by their ability to maintain their employer's appearance. Even with such demanding expectations, some attendants developed a sense of pride in their work. They became known for steady technique, consistent results, and the ability to adapt to emerging trends. Their skill allowed them to maintain positions for many years, even as external fashions shifted repeatedly. Yet this pride existed quietly, alongside the pressure of constant evaluation. Training institutions remained essential because Victorian hair culture depended heavily on precision. Hairstyles that seemed simple from afar contained layers of preparation, invisible to most observers. Without trained attendants, many women could not have maintained the appearance required of them. The institutions served as a reminder that beauty in this era was less a matter of individuality and more a matter of discipline, instruction, and strict routine. By the end of each training cycle, attendants carried with them a set of skills that defined their future. Their work would support households where beauty functioned as a social expectation rather than a personal expression. These institutions produced not only skilled workers, but also the unseen labor force that upheld Victorian beauty standards day after day. Training centers reinforced a system in which hair preparation became a structured duty rather than a simple routine. Their influence showed how much hidden labor supported public displays of elegance. In the background of these practices, another form of control tied to appearance continues to build. Expectations around women's hair were deeply connected to the ways men viewed authority within their households. Many young women were taught early that their appearance, especially their hair, functioned as a measure of obedience. This belief did not always need to be spoken directly. It lived quietly within traditions, gestures, and daily routines. When a woman presented herself each morning, her hairstyle signaled more than simple grooming. It reflected the degree to which she aligned herself with the preferences of the man she lived with. The idea that hair served as a form of attraction was reinforced through social instruction. Women were told that the length, texture, and arrangement of their hair influenced how they were perceived. Older relatives, manuals, and domestic guides repeated the same message. Hair was one of the first details a man noticed. This message slowly shaped the choices women felt permitted to make, and it became part of the domestic atmosphere, even in houses without strict rules. The sense of responsibility settled, quietly tightening boundaries around personal expression. Many households developed specific expectations about what was considered appropriate. A wife was often assumed to maintain a hairstyle that aligned with her husband's preferences, even when those preferences were tied to trends rather than comfort. Some men favored tightly arranged styles that demonstrated order and discipline. Others insisted on long, uncut hair because it matched cultural ideals of femininity. When these expectations were repeated across generations, they began to appear natural rather than imposed. Women often accepted them as part of married life, even when the routines caused fatigue or inconvenience. In homes where conformity was emphasized, deviations attracted quick attention. If a woman cut her hair short, lightened its color, or attempted a style associated with modern influence, reactions tended to be immediate. Neighbors might whisper about impropriety, relatives might suggest she reconsider, and husbands might interpret the change as a challenge rather than a preference. Her hair, visible to everyone in public and private spaces, became a surface on which approval or disapproval could be projected. Individual preference faded behind the weight of interpretation. Domestic instructions reinforced this pressure. Women were advised to maintain hair in ways that aligned with ideas of modesty and respectability. Manuals described specific grooming standards, linking them to discipline and household harmony. A woman who followed these expectations was praised as dependable, while a woman who chose differently risked being labeled unpredictable. The connection between appearance and obedience grew stronger, with each repeated message building a quiet but persistent form of social control. Within marriages, these expectations intersected with daily routines. A woman might wake early to prepare her hair before anyone else saw her. This act was not about vanity, but about ensuring she met the standards assigned to her. Hair became part of the cadence of domestic life, carrying weight despite its physical lightness. Even on tiring days, she was expected to maintain consistency, because inconsistency could be misread as emotional instability or disregard for her role. Some women complied to avoid conflict. Others complied because resistance carried consequences both subtle and public. A new hairstyle could attract questions at gatherings or silence at dinner tables. Families occasionally interpreted such changes as indications of dissatisfaction within the household. Community expectations amplified the internal pressure, making small choices feel heavy. The cost of personal expression outweighed the appeal of experimentation. These norms also reflected broader structures of authority. Male approval often determined the emotional atmosphere of a home. A woman's hair, being one of the most visible parts of her appearance, became a focal point through which approval was granted or withheld. Even when husbands were not explicitly controlling cultural expectations, shaped their reactions. The influence was absorbed almost unconsciously, embedded in assumptions about beauty and propriety. Women lived within these boundaries, adjusting their routines to match the roles assigned to them. Despite the tension, many women navigated these expectations quietly. They learned how to maintain appearances without drawing unnecessary attention. Their compliance was often mistaken for agreement, even though their internal views remained private. The silence surrounding these routines contributed to their persistence. Without open discussion, the expectations continued, unchallenged, forming part of the invisible fabric of domestic life. From the perspective of someone observing these households, the continuity is striking. Hairstyles changed with fashion, but the underlying control remained. The standards varied from one region to another, but the pressure was consistent. Women were encouraged to present themselves in ways that reflected collective values rather than personal comfort. Their grooming habits revealed the extent to which beauty functioned as a regulated duty rather than a personal expression. This pattern created long-lasting consequences. When expectations were tied to appearance, personal choices became restricted without the need for explicit enforcement. The boundaries remained steady because they were woven into everyday life. Women moved within these constraints, adjusting to them as one adjusts to the weight of clothing worn every day. The pressure did not fade. It simply blended into the background of domestic routines. In the larger context of Victorian culture, these expectations reflected how deeply beauty was intertwined with authority. A woman's hair was not just a feature, it was a symbol of her place within her family and community. The standards imposed upon it shaped her daily life in ways that often went unspoken. Those observing this system could see how grooming became a form of quiet regulation, maintained not through force, but through repetition, expectation, and the fear of appearing out of place. Hair expectations formed quiet rules that settled into the routines of daily life. Those unspoken demands lingered in every household, guiding choices more strongly than anyone admitted. When those pressures grow heavier, the consequences begin revealing themselves in unexpected ways. Accidents involving women's hair were more common in Victorian life than many people today would imagine. The elaborate styles, the layers of false hair, the heavy oils, and the daily proximity to open flames created conditions in which danger remained constantly present. When walking through a home lit entirely by candles, a woman carried the quiet risk of her hair brushing too close to a flame. The high arrangements, often rising several inches above the scalp, increased this danger, making even routine movements unsafe. One of the most unsettling incidents came from the way candles were positioned throughout Victorian interiors. Rooms were often dim, and women leaned close to the lighting without fully noticing. Hair treated with oils and pomades burned quickly, creating a sudden flash of heat that left little time to react. Witnesses described moments in which a single candle brushed a curl, and the entire arrangement ignited in seconds, leaving nothing but smoke and the scent of scorched hair. Injuries from these incidents were severe, and some women did not survive the burns. Beyond fire, mechanical accidents were equally common. Urban streets, filled with carriages, created a hazardous environment for women wearing long or voluminous hairstyles. Hairpieces, especially large false additions, could be caught easily in hinges, carriage steps, or the narrow gaps between moving parts. Reports described women whose wigs were pulled violently when a wheel or rope caught hold of a loose strand. In these moments, the force was strong enough to tear hair from the scalp, leaving wounds that required weeks to heal. The embarrassment often prevented victims from speaking openly about what happened. Inside industrial spaces, the dangers increased further. Machines with exposed gears and pulleys posed a constant threat to anyone with long hair. Although women were warned to tie their hair tightly, fashion standards conflicted with safety, and many preferred to maintain visible styles even when working. When hair became tangled in rotating mechanisms, the results were immediate and devastating. Injuries ranged from deep scalp lacerations to fatal accidents, and documentation showed that some women died after being pulled into machinery by their hair. These tragedies were treated as unfortunate mishaps rather than preventable issues. Infections represented another hidden threat. Hairpieces, pins, combs, and the scraping of tight styling routines created small cuts on the scalp. These openings allowed bacteria to enter, especially in environments where hygiene was limited. Women frequently reused tools without cleaning them properly. The combination of sweat, dust, and residue from pomades created a setting in which wounds were slow to heal. Some women developed abscesses that spread from the scalp to the neck, leading to fevers and systemic infections. Without advanced medical treatment, even a minor injury could become life-threatening. The presence of false hair increased the risk of infection. Wigs absorbed moisture and trapped heat, creating a warm environment for bacteria. Women who wore heavy pieces for long hours often developed rashes or sores beneath them, and the lack of ventilation made recovery difficult. Medical records from the period mentioned cases in which prolonged use of wigs contributed to severe scalp inflammation. In certain circumstances, infection spreads beyond the skin and affects deeper tissue, resulting in long-term health consequences that extend beyond cosmetic discomfort. These accidents were rarely discussed openly. Social pressure to maintain a graceful appearance pushed women to hide their injuries. Burns were concealed beneath fabric or carefully adjusted hair. Scalp wounds were treated privately and mentioned only in vague terms. When a tragedy became public, it was often framed as a misfortune rather than a symptom of dangerous beauty practices. Women who suffered in these incidents bore their injuries in silence, continuing to follow the same grooming routines that caused them. Even within households, accidents shaped the daily atmosphere. Servants who assisted with hairstyling faced their own risks, often handling heated tools or sharp pins with little training. A small slip could result in injury to either the servant or the woman being groomed. These events added tension to the already demanding routine of maintaining Victorian hairstyles. The expectation of perfection remained constant regardless of the risks involved. The combination of fire machinery, infection, and physical strain revealed how delicate the boundary was between beauty and danger. What seemed like a simple matter of fashion carried consequences that affected women's health and safety. Those who observed these patterns could see how a hairstyle admired for its elegance created vulnerabilities in everyday situations. The accidents were not anomalies, but rather a quiet companion to the beauty standards of the era. When viewed in the wider context of Victorian life, these incidents reflected how heavily women were burdened by expectations. Hairstyles were not simply decorative, they were obligations accompanied by physical hazards. Each incident, whether a small burn or a fatal injury, illustrated how much risk women absorbed to meet cultural demands. The dangers embedded within these routines became a natural part of life accepted without question, because beauty was treated as a responsibility rather than a choice. Accidents, linked to elaborate hairstyles, revealed how deeply hidden risks were woven into daily routines. These events showed how appearance could outweigh caution in households and public spaces alike. As those dangers accumulate quietly, the emotional and social weight behind them starts to press against everything that surrounds them. In Victorian society, long hair was more than a feature of appearance. It functioned as a public symbol of respectability and adherence to the expectations placed on women. Maintaining length was not merely a matter of preference. It represented an unspoken agreement to uphold the ideals of feminine virtue as defined by family, community, and tradition. Cutting one's hair was seen as a disruption of that agreement, an act that seemed to signal refusal rather than practical choice. Because of this, many women lived their adult years without ever considering the possibility of reducing the weight they carried on their heads. This weight was not simply physical. The maintenance required for long hair demanded hours of work each week. Even on days when a woman felt fatigued or unwell, the expectation remained. Tangles had to be removed carefully, oils had to be applied, and the hair needed to be shaped into whichever style was considered proper for her position. These tasks were often performed silently, becoming part of the background rhythm of daily life. Their repetition turned them into obligations rather than expressions of beauty. For many women, the inability to cut their hair created a sense of confinement. Long hair restricted movement required constant attention and complicated even simple tasks. Cooking near an open flame, cleaning household items, or performing outdoor chores all carry added risk. Despite these burdens, social norms discouraged alteration. A woman with short hair might face comments from neighbors, scrutiny from relatives, or disappointment from her husband. These reactions reinforced the idea that hair was tied closely to loyalty, obedience, and emotional stability. The association between hair and dignity extended beyond individual households. Public gatherings, church events, and community activities offered opportunities to observe how women adhered to or deviated from shared expectations. Long, well-kept hair was praised as evidence of discipline. Any appearance of messy or shortened hair could be interpreted as carelessness or even moral decline. These assumptions, though unspoken, contributed to an atmosphere in which self-expression was quietly suppressed. In moments of private reflection, some women likely felt the desire to free themselves from the constant responsibility. The physical weight of long hair, especially when combined with false additions or heavy pomades, caused headaches, neck strain, and discomfort. The emotional weight was harder to measure, but just as present. The knowledge that their hair functioned more as a symbol than a choice added a layer of tension to their routines. Yet the option to remove this pressure by cutting their hair remained inaccessible, as doing so would place them outside the boundaries of social acceptance. Within families, the pressure was transmitted through generations. Mothers taught daughters the importance of maintaining length and grooming with precision. These lessons were framed as preparation for adulthood, as though a woman's identity depended on the condition of her hair. The repetition of these messages gave them authority, embedding them deeply in the daily habits of each household. Even those who questioned the tradition often continued to uphold it, influenced by the anticipation of judgment from others. The symbolic value of hair was further reinforced through mourning practices. Widows adhered to strict guidelines regarding the appearance of their hair, which needed to remain subdued and unaltered. These rules emphasized that hair not only reflected personal grooming, but also represented emotional states dictated by social custom. This connection between hair and beauty created another level of control shaping behavior through symbols rather than explicit rules. Many women found themselves living within these constraints without openly acknowledging them. Their routines developed around the expectations, and over time, the boundaries felt less like impositions and more like conditions of life that could not be changed. Even in moments of discomfort or resentment, the fear of appearing improper outweighed the desire for ease. Hair became a form of silent communication, carrying messages that women themselves did not always choose. The external beauty of long, elegant hair concealed the internal strain it caused. Beneath carefully arranged layers, women dealt with tangles, pulling, breakage, and soreness. These physical irritations accumulated over the years, contributing to fatigue and stress. Observers might admire the polished result without considering the labor that sustained it. The distance between appearance and experience was wide, yet seldom acknowledged. For those who attempted to deviate from the expectation, the consequences could be immediate. A woman who chose to cut her hair risked speculation about her motives. She might be described as unstable, rebellious, or careless. Such labels remained attached long after the haircut itself, affecting how she was perceived in social and domestic settings. This reaction further discouraged others from considering similar actions, maintaining the cycle of conformity. In broader cultural terms, the inability to cut hair revealed how Victorian society used beauty to reinforce discipline. Women's hair became a tool through which compliance was monitored, rewarded, or punished. This form of control was subtle enough to appear natural, yet powerful enough to shape entire lifetimes. Observers could see how deeply the expectations ran, influencing behavior through a combination of tradition, pressure, and silent judgment. Long hair operated as both a badge of respectability and a constant source of strain. The demands behind it shaped routines that affected women more deeply than most recognized. With these pressures steadily intensifying, another layer of the Victorian beauty system begins to expose its quiet toll. Printed images and cultural illustrations of Victorian women created a version of beauty that felt distant from everyday reality. In magazines, portraits, and advertisements, hair appeared impossibly full, smooth, and polished. These depictions were crafted with deliberate intention, emphasizing shine and volume in ways that ordinary grooming could never fully achieve. The images were carefully retouched or illustrated by artists who understood that the goal was not accuracy, but aspiration. As a result, women who viewed these images were presented with a standard that existed more on paper than in life. The glossy surfaces of fashion magazines highlighted hairstyles that required hours of preparation. Even though many women understood that these looks were uncommon outside elite circles, the repetition of the same visual ideal created quiet pressure. Readers would study the images, noting each curl and wave, and measure their own appearance against the pages held in their hands. This comparison became part of the private experience of reading, influencing how women evaluated themselves long after the magazine was put away. Paintings reinforced this idealization even further. Portrait artists added smoothness and symmetry to their subjects, enhancing details that might not have existed naturally. Stray hairs were removed, textures were softened, and light was painted in ways that made hair appear healthier than any real hair could consistently be. These artistic adjustments were not seen as deceptive at the time. They were considered polite enhancements, part of the cultural expectation to present subjects at their best. However, these enhancements contributed to unrealistic standards that ordinary women could not meet. Within wealthier households, these images circulated freely. Magazines were placed on tables where guests could see them, and framed prints hung on walls, encouraging constant comparison. Women who already struggled with hair that was thin, brittle, or uneven found themselves confronted daily with representations that seemed effortless and perfect. The more they saw these images, the more they internalized the idea that their own appearance was inadequate. This quiet erosion of self-confidence did not happen suddenly, but accumulated over the years. Even in rural areas, where access to printed materials was less common, cultural pressure still reached women through traveling advertisements, posters, and copied illustrations. These simplified images maintained the same exaggerated features, presenting hair that glowed with an unrealistic sheen. Villagers who encountered these depictions might not have had the luxury to pursue complex hairstyles, yet the images still shaped their sense of what beauty looked like. The divide between representation and reality expanded, but the influence remained. The pressure created by these images extended beyond individual perception. Social gatherings often became unintentional arenas for comparison. Women who managed to approximate the illustrated ideals received more admiration, while those whose hair did not conform felt heightened self-awareness. Compliments were given selectively, reinforcing the hierarchy shaped by printed culture. In this way, the influence of images stretched into community interactions, affecting how women related to one another and how they evaluated their own worth. This tension increased for women with naturally thin or thinning hair. Cultural illustrations rarely acknowledge such variations. Instead, they showcase thick layers of hair, arranged symmetrically and without visible weakness. Women who did not match these ideals often experienced quiet embarrassment. They tried to conceal thin areas with combing techniques, added padding, or strategic styling. But these efforts only masked the insecurity rather than removing it. Some women avoided social gatherings on days when their hair did not behave, illustrating how deeply cultural imagery shaped behavior. False hairpieces became more popular, partly because of these pressures. When faced with idealized depictions, many women believed that adding hair was the only way to achieve an acceptable appearance. This belief, reinforced through repeated exposure to polished illustrations, encouraged reliance on wigs, pads, and extensions, even when these additions caused discomfort or hygiene issues. The desire to avoid judgment outweighed concerns about practicality. The cycle repeated with each new magazine issue or painted portrait that displayed perfection. For younger girls, exposure to these ideals began early. They saw their mothers studying images, adjusting their hair, or expressing dissatisfaction with their own appearance. These observations shaped how young girls understood the importance of hair and beauty. Even before adulthood, they learned that appearance was something to worry about, compare, and improve. Cultural imagery thus contributed to an early internalization of standards that would follow them throughout their lives. Artists and publishers rarely questioned the impact of their work. Their goal was to attract viewers and sell products not to reflect ordinary life. Hair tonic advertisements relied on illustrations that exaggerated shine and volume. Wig sellers commissioned drawings that made their products appear lighter and more natural than they truly were. These visual exaggerations created expectations that could not be met without assistance, deepening the divide between real and ideal. Over time, the cultural landscape became saturated with these visual messages. Even those who knew the images were unrealistic found themselves influenced by them. The repetition was powerful. A single, exaggerated portrait might be dismissed, but dozens of similar images across years created an unspoken sense of truth. The ideal became normalized, while natural variation came to feel like failure. The emotional weight of this influence was not always visible. Women rarely spoke about their insecurities openly, especially in a society that emphasized modesty and composure. Instead, the pressure remained internal. Quiet comparison and private self-judgment shaped how women prepared themselves each day. The result was a constant, subtle tension that accompanied the act of grooming, turning what might have been a simple task into a daily test against cultural expectations. Cultural images offered polished versions of beauty that few women could truly match. These idealized depictions shaped quiet insecurities that settled into daily routines. As these pressures expand beyond the printed page, the physical consequences behind them begin to cast a heavier shadow. The conditions that developed on women's scalps during the Victorian era were often treated as private inconveniences rather than signs of deeper harm. Daily routines involving heavy pomades, restrictive hairstyles, and prolonged tension created an environment where skin problems could grow steadily. Folliculitis, fungal infections, and chronic irritation appeared, gradually building layer upon layer of discomfort that many women learned to endure silently. These issues were rarely acknowledged publicly, as speaking about them risked revealing the physical strain behind admired appearances. Folliculitis was one of the most common problems. The combination of oils, sweat, and trapped debris caused small, inflamed bumps to appear across the scalp. Women who wore wigs or pads for long periods experienced this frequently. The enclosed space beneath hairpieces held moisture against the skin, allowing bacteria to thrive. Each inflamed area created tenderness that made brushing or styling painful. Yet most women continued with their grooming routines because halting them was not an acceptable option. They carried the discomfort quietly, concealing redness beneath layers of hair. Fungal infections emerged for similar reasons. Moisture lingering under wigs, along with residue from pomades, created an ideal environment for fungal growth. Symptoms such as scaling, itching, and patchy hair loss were common, though rarely discussed. Medical care for such conditions was limited, and early treatments could be harsh or ineffective. Many women resorted to covering the infected areas more tightly, unintentionally worsening the problem by reducing airflow. This cycle of concealment and irritation continued for months or even years. Contact dermatitis became widespread as the use of hair products expanded. Pomades containing animal fat perfumes and chemical additives frequently caused allergic reactions. After repeated exposure, the scalp could become dry, cracked, or inflamed. Because Victorian culture emphasized composure, women often tolerated the pain rather than disclose it. Scalp irritation was hidden under pins, braids, and added hair, all of which intensified the pressure on sensitive skin. The result was a prolonged condition that few dared to acknowledge. The tight styles favored by Victorian fashion placed immense strain on hair follicles. Repeated pulling gradually weakened the roots, leading to early onset thinning for many women. This process unfolded so slowly that those experiencing it often blamed themselves rather than the styles they were obligated to maintain. They tried to compensate by adding padding or arranging their hair in ways that concealed thinning areas. These adjustments offered temporary solutions, but did nothing to relieve the underlying strain causing the loss. In the most severe cases, traction alopecia developed. Years of prolonged tension damaged the follicles permanently, creating patches where hair never grew back. For women whose sense of respectability was tied closely to the appearance of their hair, this condition brought quiet distress. They faced expectations that required thick and carefully maintained hair, yet the very routines meant to achieve this result contributed to its decline. The contradiction intensified the emotional burden of a condition already difficult to accept. Beyond the physical consequences, the psychological impact of hair-related illness shaped women's internal lives. Changes in hair, density, texture, or condition carried social meaning, influencing how a woman viewed herself and how others interpreted her appearance. Women who experienced hair loss or visible irritation might fear judgment, choosing to withdraw from social gatherings or limit their public presence. Their silence deepened the emotional strain, allowing private distress to accumulate without relief. Depression often followed. The persistent discomfort of scalp conditions, combined with the pressure to maintain appearances, created a sense of isolation. Women who felt ashamed of their hair problems rarely sought support. The cultural expectation of composure discouraged any admission of vulnerability. As a result, emotional struggles remained hidden beneath routines that demanded precision despite pain. The act of grooming became a reminder of the gap between appearance and physical reality. Medical understanding of these conditions was limited. Physicians sometimes recognized scalp disorders, but attributed them to general weakness or poor hygiene, rather than to a restrictive fashion. Because the connection between styling practices and illness was rarely acknowledged, treatment options offered little relief. Ointments or washes prescribed for the conditions could irritate the skin further. Women continued their routines out of obligation, and their conditions lingered. Within households, these problems shaped the rhythm of daily life. A woman with an inflamed scalp might move more slowly, avoid certain activities, or decline invitations. Family members often remained unaware of the reason. The discomfort remained a private burden, carried through quiet adjustments and attempts to minimize pain while maintaining social expectations. The ongoing strain blended into the background of domestic duties unnoticed by others. In a broader sense, these illnesses revealed the conflict between cultural ideals and physical limitations. Victorian beauty standards required perfection, yet the methods used to achieve that perfection undermined women's health. The very routines meant to enhance appearance simultaneously compromised well-being. Observers who paid attention could see the tension between external elegance and internal discomfort, though few acknowledged it openly. As time passed, the cumulative effect of these conditions etched itself into women's lives. Physical pain became familiar, emotional weight settled quietly, and the distance between idealized imagery and lived experience widened. The illnesses associated with hair were rarely dramatic, but their persistence shaped how women navigated each day. Beneath polished surfaces, a quieter story of strain and endurance unfolded largely unnoticed by those who admired Victorian beauty from a distance. Hair-related illnesses revealed how beauty routines could wear down both the body and the mind. These conditions lingered behind elegant appearances, shaping women's lives in ways few truly recognized. Once these burdens deepen into everyday life, the final layers of this history begin to reveal their heaviest truths. There is a quiet weight that settles over the story of Victorian women, and their hair a weight built from years of routines that were carried out without question. These routines shaped the lives of countless women who lived under expectations they did not create, yet were required to uphold. When looking back on the elegant silhouettes preserved in paintings, portraits, and museum displays, it is difficult to sense the strain beneath the surface. The images appear calm, controlled, and refined. They leave no trace of the discomfort hidden in the hours that came before the moment the portrait was painted or the photograph was taken. The hairstyles admired today were not simple markers of beauty. They were structures held together by pins, oils, pomades, and sometimes the hair of other people. Maintaining them required patience, endurance, and a willingness to remain still through long preparations. Women lived lives that revolved around these expectations, preparing themselves to be seen in ways that aligned with cultural ideals rather than personal comfort. Beneath the polished appearance, there were burns, tension, headaches, sores, and infections. These injuries became ordinary, absorbed into daily life, as though they were unavoidable parts of womanhood. Throughout this history, control operated quietly. A woman's hair communicated something about her status, her discipline, and her conformity to social norms. The styles she wore reflected expectations from husbands, families, and communities. These expectations limited her choices long before she lifted a comb. Cutting her hair could be seen as defiance. Wearing it loosely might be considered improper. Every strand carried meaning, though the meaning was seldom spoken aloud. This silent system shaped not only how women looked, but how they behaved and how they were perceived. The industries built around hair took advantage of these pressures. Wigs and false hair were collected from sources that were rarely acknowledged, including the poverty-stricken and the deceased. The products reached the heads of wealthy women without any trace of their origins. The elegance enjoyed by some was tied to the desperation experienced by others. Pain and privilege existed side by side, connected through materials that passed from one life into another without recognition. These connections were hidden, leaving only the illusion of refinement. In the domestic routines of Victorian women, hair care played a central role. Rooms filled with fumes from lamps, candles, and heated irons created environments where accidents were common. Women suffered burns when their hair brushed too close to flames. Hairpieces caught in machinery or carriage wheels caused serious injuries. Scalp infections spread slowly, fed by moisture trapped beneath wigs or layers of pomade. These were not dramatic tragedies that made newspaper headlines. They were quiet incidents that accumulated across years, shaping how women moved, how they worked, and how they endured. Emotionally, the impact was just as heavy. Hair became a source of anxiety for those who did not naturally match the standards displayed in magazines. Women with thinning hair or scalp conditions hid their worries behind carefully arranged styles. Shame grew silently because speaking about these struggles felt improper. Appearance was treated as a measure of character, making it difficult for women to admit discomfort or dissatisfaction. Many learned to carry these burdens without drawing attention, adjusting their routines to minimize the evidence of their struggles. When considering all of these layers together, the physical strain, the emotional pressure, the social expectations, and the industries that exploited them, it becomes clear that elegant Victorian hairstyles were built on more than creativity and fashion. They were constructed through systems that required women to sacrifice comfort, autonomy, and health. Even so, the surviving representations focus on beauty rather than harm. Portraits show smooth surfaces, not the soreness beneath. Paintings immortalize grace, not the fatigue involved in achieving it. The women behind these images lived lives far more complex than the still scenes left to history. The distance between what we see and what they experienced is wide. Modern viewers admire the artistry of their styles without sensing the constraints surrounding them. The past is often remembered through fragments, and hairstyles become symbols detached from the suffering that accompanied them. The fires, infections, and injuries fade into footnotes, overshadowed by the elegance preserved in museums. Yet the truth remains that beauty in this era was not neutral. It required endurance, obedience, and silence. As the story reaches its end, the silence becomes more noticeable. Many of these women left no written accounts describing their discomfort or fear. Their lives were shaped by routines that went unrecorded. What remains are images that emphasize perfection while concealing everything that created it. These images are steady, quiet, and polished, They cannot reveal the moments of pain that came before them, nor can they speak for the women who submitted to expectations they could not escape. Looking back now, the history of Victorian hair appears to be a history of contradictions. It blended beauty with difficulty, admiration with injury, and refinement with control. It produced styles that were admired publicly but endured privately. The women who carried these burdens did so without recognition their efforts, hidden behind smooth curls and carefully arranged volumes. Their labor is visible only through careful examination of the conditions that shaped their world. This final chapter does not aim to create pity, but to acknowledge what was overlooked. Behind every elegant hairstyle was a story of persistence. Behind each polished portrait was a woman navigating expectations that demanded quiet endurance. Behind all the admiration now directed at Victorian fashion lies a history of discomfort that deserves to be remembered rather than forgotten. As you prepare to rest, let the echo of their lives settle gently. The weight they carried does not need to be carried by you. Their silence does not need to be repeated. Tonight, you can let the stories fade into softness, knowing they have finally been seen with clearer eyes. Good night. May your rest be calm, and may the burdens of the past loosen their hold as you drift into sleep.